107. The Truth, PT4. The spiraling leaves of the gigantic Dieffenbachia felt like forest loam beneath Harry's shoes, not as unyielding as concrete, but supporting his weight. Harry kept a wary eye on the tendrils, but they remained passive. When Harry reached the bottom of the leafy spiral staircase, the tendrils suddenly whipped out and grasped Harry's arms and legs. After a brief struggle, Harry allowed himself to go limp. "Interesting," said Professor Quirrell as he floated down from above, not touching any of the plant's leaves or tendrils. "I noticed that you seem to have no trouble losing to a plant." Harry looked more closely at the defense professor, seeing him now without the lens of panic. Professor Quirrell was upright and moving, flying without apparent difficulty. The sense of doom about him was strong, but his eyes were still sunken in the skull, his arms thin and wasted. The sickness had not been bluff, and the obvious hypothesis was that the defense professor had recently eaten another unicorn to temporarily regain some strength. And the defense professor was also speaking like the mask of Professor Quirrell, not like Lord Voldemort, which might not be a bad thing from Harry's perspective. Harry didn't know why, unless it was that the defense professor still needed him for something, but it certainly seemed to be in Harry's own interests to play along. "You specifically let me walk into this trap, Professor," Harry answered, just the way he'd have spoken to Professor Quirrell. "Roles, masks, remind him of how it was between us. On my own, I'd have used my broomstick. Perhaps. How would an ordinary first year solve this challenge? If they had their wand, that is." The plant was now reaching tendrils out toward Professor Quirrell, but Professor Quirrell was hovering just out of their reach. Harry had now remembered Professor Sprout talking about a devil's snare plant, which the herbology textbook had said liked cool, dark places like caves, though how that could be true of a leafy plant was anyone's guess. At a guess, I'd say this is a devil's snare plant, and it might retreat from light or heat. So maybe a first year could use Lumos. Today I'd use Inflammer, but I didn't learn that spell until May. A twirl of the defense professor's wand, and a pattern of sprays of liquid shot out from it, striking the plant near the bases of its tendrils, hitting with a quiet splat and then a quiet hissing. All the tendrils touching Harry frantically shot back and began to beat at the growing wounds appearing on the plant's skin, as if trying to remove the pain stimulus. Something about the plant gave the impression that it was screaming soundlessly. Professor Quirrell finished drifting downward. "Now it is afraid of light, heat, acid, and me." Harry stepped off the final leaves onto the floor, after a careful glance at his robes, and then the floor to make sure that none of the acid had splashed anywhere. Harry had begun to suspect that Professor Quirrell was trying to make some sort of point, but Harry did not know what that point might be. "I thought we were on a mission, Professor. I can't stop you, but is it smart to spend this much time on messing with me?" "Oh, we have time," said Professor Quirrell, sounding amused. "There would be a great uproar if we were discovered here, guarded by an Inferius. You did not act like you had heard of such an uproar at your Quidditch match, before you arrived in this time and spoke to Snape as you did." A slight chill came over Harry as he comprehended this. Anything he did to beat Professor Quirrell would have to not disrupt the school, or at least the Quidditch game, because it hadn't disrupted the Quidditch game. Even if enough forces could be called in to subdue Lord Voldemort, it might not be easy to do it without Professor McGonagall or Professor Flitwick or anyone else at the Quidditch game noticing. Fighting a smart enemy was hard, and even so it seemed to Harry that if he stood in Professor Quirrell's shoes, he would not be having leisurely conversations and playing mind games. Professor Quirrell was gaining something by taking his time here. But what? Was there some other process that had to run to completion? "By the by, have you betrayed me yet?" said Professor Quirrell. "Have not betrayed you yet," Harry hissed. The defense professor gestured pointedly with the gun he was now holding in his left hand, and Harry walked ahead to the great wooden door at the end of the room and opened it. The next chamber was smaller in diameter, with a higher ceiling. The light shining out of the arched alcoves was white instead of blue. Around them whizzed hundreds of winged keys, beating frantically through the air. After watching for a few seconds, it became clear that only a single key was the golden color of a snitch, though it was moving slower than a snitch in a real Quidditch game. On the other end of the room was a door containing a large, prominent keyhole. Against the left wall leaned a broomstick, the school's workhorse Cleansweep 7. "Professor," Harry said, staring up at the clouds and flarks of whizzing keys. "You said you would answer my questions. What exactly is all this about? If you think you've secured a door so that it won't open without a key, you keep the key in a safe place and only give a copy to authorized entrance. You don't give the key wings and then leave a broomstick propped against the wall. So what the heck are we doing in here, and what is going on?" It's an obvious guess that the magic mirror is the only real factor guarding the stone, but why the rest of this, and why encourage first years to come here? "I am truly not sure," said the defense professor. He had entered the room and taken up station well to Harry's right, maintaining the distance between them. "But I shall answer, as I said I would. Dumbledore's way is to do a dozen things which seem mad, and then only 8 of them, or perhaps 9, conceal an inner meaning. My guess is that Dumbledore intends to make it seem like I am invited to send a student as my proxy, precisely so that Lord Voldemort, as Dumbledore conceives of him, is less tempted to think himself clever by doing so. Imagine Dumbledore first considering the issue of how to ward the stone. Imagine Dumbledore considering whether to set true dangers to guard the mirror. Imagine him imagining some young student blundering through those dangers at my behest. I think that is what Dumbledore is trying to avoid by making it seem as though that strategy is invited and so not cunning. Unless, of course, I have misunderstood what Dumbledore thinks Lord Voldemort will think." Professor Quirrell grinned, and it looked just as natural on him as any grin he'd shown Harry before. Plotting does not come naturally to Dumbledore, but he tries because he must. To that task, Dumbledore brings intelligence, dedication, the ability to learn from his mistakes, and an utter lack of native talent. He is marvelously hard to predict for that reason alone. Harry turned away, looking at the door on the opposite side of the room. "It wasn't a game to him, Professor. My guess is that the intended solution for first years is to ignore the broomstick and use Wingardium Leviosa to grab the key, since this isn't a Quidditch game and there are no rules forbidding that. So what absurdly overpowered spell are you going to unleash on this one then?" There was a brief silence, but for the whizzing of keys. Harry took several steps away from Professor Quirrell. "I probably shouldn't have said that, should I?" "Oh, no," Professor Quirrell said. "I think that is a quite reasonable thing to say to the most powerful dark wizard in the world when he is standing not a dozen paces from you." Professor Quirrell put his wand back into the sleeve of his other hand, the hand that sometimes held the gun. Then the defense professor reached into his mouth and took out what appeared to be a tooth. He tossed the false tooth high in the air, and when it came down, it had transformed into a wand that sparked a strange sense of recognition in Harry's mind, as though some part of him recognized that wand as being part of him. 13.5 inches, with a core of phoenix feather. Harry had memorized the information when the wand maker Ollie something had given it, because it had seemed like it might be plot relevant. The event and the thinking that had underlain it both felt a lifetime distant. The defense professor raised that wand and traced in the air a flaming rune that was all jagged edges and malevolence. Harry took another instinctive step back. Then Professor Quirrell spoke. "Azreth, Azreth, Azreth." The flaming rune began pouring out fire that was twisted, as though the jagged edges of the rune had become the nature of the fire itself. The fire was blazing crimson, shaded further red than blood, glowing as searingly intense as an arquelda. That brilliance in that shade seemed wrong in its own right, like nothing shaded so far red should give off that much light, and the searing crimson was shot through with veins of black that seemed to suck the light from the fire. Within the blackened fire, outlined in the interplay of crimson and darkness, animal shapes twisted wildly from one predator to another, cobra to hyena to scorpion. "Azreth, Azreth, Azreth." When Professor Quirrell had repeated the word 6 times, as much black crimson fire had poured out as the volume of a small bush. The cursed fire slowed in its changes as Professor Quirrell locked eyes upon it, taking on a single form, the form of a blackened, blood-burning phoenix. And something told Harry with a terrible certainty that if that black burning phoenix met Fawkes, the true phoenix would die and never be reborn. Professor Quirrell made a single gesture with his wand, and the blackened fire went soaring across the room. It met the door and its keyhole, and with a single sweep of crimson-burning wings, most of the door and part of the archway was consumed. Then the tainted crimson blaze swept on. Harry had only a glance through the hole to see huge statues just beginning to raise swords and clubs when the blackened fire came among them, and they cracked and burned. When it ended, the blackened fire phoenix swept back in through the hole and hovered above Professor Quirrell's left shoulder, the sun-intense crimson claws staying an inch from his robes. "Go on ahead," said Professor Quirrell. "It's safe now." Harry walked forward, needing to invoke his dark side's cognitive patterns in order to maintain calm enough to do it. Harry stepped over the glowing edges of the remaining part of the door and gazed at a chessboard of ruined, huge chess pieces. The alternating tiles of black and white marble on the floor started 5 meters after the ruined doorway and extended from wall to wall, but stopped 5 meters short of the next door on the opposite side of the room. The ceiling was significantly higher than any of the statues should have been able to reach. "I would guess," Harry said, and his dark side's cognitive patterns kept his voice calm, that the intended solution is to fly over the statues using the broomstick from the previous room, since it wasn't actually needed to get the key. From behind, Professor Quirrell laughed, and it was Lord Voldemort's laugh. "Proceed," said a voice grown colder and higher. "Go to the next room. I wish to see what you will make of what is there." Arranged by Dumbledore for first years, Harry reminded himself it will be safe, and he walked across the ruined chessboard, laid his hand upon that door's handle, and pushed it inward. Half a second later, Harry slammed the door and leapt back. It took Harry several seconds to master his breathing and master himself. From behind the door came continued loud bellows and great slams as of a rock club pounding the floor. "I suppose," Harry said in a voice grown cold as well, "that since Dumbledore would hardly put a real mountain troll in there, the next challenge is an illusion of my worst memories, like a Dementor with the memory projected into the outside world. Very amusing, Professor." Professor Quirrell advanced himself toward the door, and Harry stepped well aside. Besides the sense of doom that was now strong about the professor, Harry's dark side, or just plain instinct, was advising him not to get anywhere near that black-crimson fire hovering above Professor Quirrell's shoulder. Professor Quirrell swung open the door and looked in. Professor Quirrell said. "Just the troll, as you say. Ah, well. I had hoped to learn something about you more interesting than that. What lies within is a Cocorhecus, also known as the common boggart." "A boggart. What does that know? I suppose I know what it does." "A boggart," Professor Quirrell said, and now his voice was again that of a Hogwarts professor lecturing, "gravitates to dark enclosures that are rarely opened, such as a neglected cupboard in the attic. It seeks to be left alone, and it will manifest in whatever form it thinks will scare you away." "Scare me away," Harry said. "I killed the troll." You leapt backward out of the room without thinking. A boggart seeks out the instinctive flinch, not the reasoned threat. Else it would have selected something more believable. In any case, the standard countercharm for a boggart is, of course, fiendfire. Professor Quirrell gestured, and the blackened fire leapt off his shoulder and poured through the doorway. From within the room there was a single squeak, and then nothing. They advanced into the boggart's former room, Professor Quirrell going first this time. With the seeming mountain troll gone, the room was just another huge chamber lit by sconces of cold blue light. Professor Quirrell's gaze seemed distant, thoughtful. He crossed the room without waiting for Harry and swung open the door on the opposite wall of his own accord. Harry followed after, and not closely. The next chamber contained a cauldron, a rack of bottled ingredients, chopping boards, stirring sticks, and the other apparatus of potions. The light coming from the arched alcoves was white instead of blue, presumably because color vision was important to potions brewing. Professor Quirrell was already standing next to the brewing apparatus, scrutinizing a long parchment he had picked up. The door to the next chamber was guarded by a curtain of purple fire that would have looked a lot more threatening if it hadn't seemed pale and weak by comparison to the blackened flame hovering over Professor Quirrell's shoulder. Harry's suspension of disbelief had already checked out on vacation at this point, so he didn't say anything about how real-world security systems had the goal of distinguishing authorized from unauthorized personnel, which meant issuing challenges that behaved differently around people who were or weren't supposed to be there. For example, a good security challenge would be testing whether the entrant knew a lock combination that only authorized people had been told, and a bad security challenge would be testing whether the entrant could brew a potion according to written instructions that had been helpfully included. Professor Quirrell tossed the parchment toward Harry, and it fluttered to the ground between them. "What do you make of this?" said Professor Quirrell, who then stepped back so that Harry could come forward and pick up the parchment. "Nope," Harry said after skimming the parchment. Testing whether the entrant can solve a ridiculously straightforward logic puzzle about the order of the ingredients is still not a challenge that behaves differently for authorized and unauthorized personnel. It doesn't matter if you use a more interesting logic puzzle about three idols or a line of people wearing colored hats, you're still completely missing the point. "Look at the other side," said Professor Quirrell. Harry turned over the 2-foot parchment. On the other side, written in tiny letters, was the longest list of brewing instructions Harry had ever seen. "What on earth?" "A potion of effulgence to quench the purple fire," Professor Quirrell said. "It is made by adding the same ingredients over and over again in slightly different ways. Imagine some eager young group of first years passing all the other chambers, thinking they are just about to reach the magic mirror, and then encountering this task. This room is the handiwork of the potion's master indeed." Harry glanced pointedly at the black fur shape on Professor Quirrell's shoulder. "Fire can't beat fire." "It can," said Professor Quirrell. "I am not sure it should. Suppose this room is trapped." Harry did not want to be stuck brewing this potion for laughs, or for whatever other reason Professor Quirrell was taking them through these chambers so slowly. The potion's recipe had 35 separate occasions for adding bellflowers, 14 times to add a lock of bright hair. Maybe the potion gives off a lethal gas that is fatal to adult wizards but not children, or any of 100 other deadly tricks, if we're suddenly being serious. Are we being serious? "This room is the handiwork of Severus Snape," Professor Quirrell said, once more looking thoughtful. "Snape is not a bystander in this game, not quite. He lacks Dumbledore's intelligence, but possesses the killing intent that Dumbledore never had." "Well, whatever's going on here, it doesn't actually keep out children," Harry observed. "Lots of first years made it through. And if you can somehow keep out everyone except children, then that, from Dumbledore's perspective, forces Lord Voldemort to possess a child to enter. I don't see the point, given their goals." "Indeed," Professor Quirrell said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But see, boy, this room lacks the triggers and tripsins that are upon the others. There are no subtle wards to be defeated. It is as if I am invited to bypass the potion and simply enter, but Snape knows that Lord Voldemort will perceive this. If in fact there was a trap laid for anyone who did not brew the potion, then it would be wiser to lay wards and give no sign that this room was different from the others." Harry listened, frowning in concentration. "So, the only point of leaving off the detection webs is to make you not bulldoze this room." "I expect Snape expects me to deduce that as well," the defense professor said. "And past that point I cannot predict at what level he thinks I will play. I am patient, and I have given myself plenty of time for this endeavor. But Snape does not know me. He only knows Lord Voldemort. He has sometimes seen Lord Voldemort shriek in frustration and act on impulses that appear counterproductive. Consider this matter from Snape's perspective. It is the potion's master of Hogwarts telling Lord Voldemort to be patient and follow instructions if he wants to enter, as though Lord Voldemort were a mere schoolboy. I would find it easy to comply, smiling the while, and take my vengeance later. But Snape does not know that Lord Voldemort finds it easy to think this way." Professor Quirrell looked at Harry. "Boy, you saw me floating in the air by the devil's snare, did you not?" Harry nodded. Then he noticed his confusion. "My charms textbook says that it's impossible for wizards to levitate themselves." "Yes," said Professor Quirrell. "That is what it says in your charms textbook. No wizard may levitate themselves, or any object supporting their own weight. It is like trying to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. Yet Lord Voldemort alone can fly. How? Answer as quickly as you can." If the question was answerable by a first-year student, you had someone else cast broomstick enchantments on your underwear, then you obliviated them. "Not quite," said Professor Quirrell. "The broomstick enchantments require a long, narrow shape, which must be solid. Cloth will not do." Harry's eyebrows furrowed. "How long does the shape have to be? Can you attach some short broomstick rods to a fabric harness and fly using those?" "Indeed, At first I strapped enchanted rods to my arms and legs, but that was only to teach myself a new mode of flight. Professor Quirrell drew back the sleeve of his robes, revealing the bare arm. As you can see, I have nothing up my sleeve right now. Harry absorbed this further constraint. You had someone cast broomstick enchantments on your bones. Professor Quirrell sighed. And that was one of Voldemort's most feared feats, or so I am told. After all these years, and some amount of reluctant legilimency, I still do not truly comprehend what is wrong with ordinary people. But you are not one of them. It is time for you to begin contributing to this expedition. You have known Severus Snape more recently than I. Tell me your own analysis of this room. Harry hesitated, trying to look thoughtful. I will mention, said Professor Quirrell, as the blackened fire phoenix on his shoulder seemed to extend its head and glare at Harry, that if you knowingly allow me to fail, I will call it betrayal. I remind you that the stone is key to Miss Granger's resurrection, and that I hold hostage the lives of hundreds of students. I remember, Harry said, and on the heels of this Harry's wonderful, inventive brain came up with a thought. Harry wasn't sure if he should say it. The silence stretched. Have you thought of anything yet? Said Professor Quirrell. Answer in Parseltongue. No, this was not going to be easy, not against a smart opponent who could force you to tell the literal truth at any time. Severus, at least the modern-day Severus, respects your intelligence a great deal, Harry said instead. I think he might expect Voldemort to believe that Severus wouldn't believe that Voldemort could pass his test of patience, but Severus would expect Voldemort to pass it. Professor Quirrell nodded. That is a plausible theory. Do you believe it yourself? Answer in Parseltongue. Yes, Harry hissed. It might not be safe to withhold information, not even thoughts and ideas. Therefore, the point of this room is to delay Lord Voldemort for an hour. And if I wanted to kill you, believing what Dumbledore believes, the obvious thing to try would be a Dementor's kiss. I mean, they think you're a disembodied soul, are you, by the way? Professor Quirrell was still. Dumbledore would not think of that method, the defense professor said after a time, but Severus might. Professor Quirrell began to tap a finger against his cheek, his gaze distant. You have power over Dementors, boy. Can you tell me if there are any nearby? Harry closed his eyes. If there were voids in the world, he could not feel them. None that I can sense. Answer in Parseltongue. Do not sense life eaters. But you were being honest with me when you suggested the possibility. You intended no clever trickery. Was honest, not trick. Perhaps there is some means by which Dementors might be concealed, being told to leap out and eat a possessing soul if they see one. Professor Quirrell was still tapping his cheek. It is not impossible that I would qualify, or it can be told to eat anyone who passes through this room too quickly, or anyone who is not a child. Bearing in mind that I hold Hermione and hundreds of other students hostage over you, would you use your power over Dementors to defend me if a Dementor unmasked itself? Answer in Parseltongue. Don't know, Harry hissed. Life Eaters cannot destroy me, I think, hissed Professor Quirrell. And I will simply abandon this body if they approach too close. Shall return swiftly this time, and then there will be no stopping me. Will torture your parents for years, to punish you for balking me. Hundreds of hostage students die, including thus you call friends. Now I ask again, will you ask power over Life Eaters to protect me if Life Eaters come? Yes, Harry whispered. The sadness and horror that Harry had pushed down flared up again, and his dark side had no stored patterns for handling the emotions. Why, Professor Quirrell, why are you like this? Professor Quirrell smiled. That reminds me. Have you betrayed me yet? Have not betrayed you yet. Professor Quirrell went over to the potions equipment and began chopping a root one-handed, the knife moving almost invisibly fast and with no apparent effort. The Fiendfur Phoenix drifted over to the opposite corner of the room and waited there. All matters considered in their uncertainty, it seems wiser to expend the time to pass this room as a first-year would, said the defense professor. We may as well talk while we are waiting. You had questions, boy. I said that I would answer them, so ask. Ch. 108, long, will post on February 20th, 2015 at 1 p.m. Pacific Time, 9 p.m. UTC. Those of you who have outstanding disputes regarding the defense professor's secrets should bet now or forever hold your peace. 108. The Truth, PT5, Answers and Riddles. The defense professor had set up a cauldron, floating it into place with a wave of his wand, another wave starting a fire beneath it. A brief circling of the defense professor's finger had set in motion a long-handled spoon, and it had continued stirring the cauldron without being held. Now the defense professor was measuring out a heap of flowers from a large jar, what Harry supposed to be bellflowers. The indigo petals seemed luminous in the white light of the walls and curved inward in a way that gave the impression of a desire for privacy. The first of these flowers had been added to the potion at once, but then the cauldron had just gone on stirring itself for a while. The defense professor had assumed a position from which he could see Harry just by turning his head slightly, and Harry knew that he was within the defense professor's peripheral vision. In the corner, a Fiendfur phoenix waited, some of the nearby stone beginning to gloss over as it melted to greater smoothness. The burning wings shed crimson light that gave everything in the room a tint of blood and reflected in scarlet sparks from the glassware. "Time is wasting," said Professor Quirrell. "Ask your questions, if you have them." "Why, Professor Quirrell? Why must you be this way? Why make yourself the monster? Why Lord Voldemort? I know you might not want the same things I do, but I can't imagine what you want that makes this the best way to get it." That was what Harry's brain wanted to know. What Harry needed to know was some way out of what was going to happen next. But the defense professor had said that he wouldn't talk about his future plans. It was strange enough that the defense professor was willing to talk about anything that had to contradict one of his rules. "I'm thinking," Harry said aloud. Professor Quirrell smiled slightly. He was using a pestle to grind the potion's first magical ingredient, a glowing red hexagon. "I quite understand," said the defense professor, "but do not think overlong, child. Goals: prevent Lord Voldemort from harming people, find a way to kill or neutralize him, but first get the stone and resurrect Hermione. Convince Professor Quirrell to stop this." Harry swallowed, pushing down the emotion, trying not to let the water reach his eyes. Tears probably wouldn't make a good impression on Lord Voldemort. Professor Quirrell was already frowning, though from the direction of his gaze, he was examining a leaf colored in vivid shades of white, green, and purple. There wasn't any obvious way to reach any of the goals, not yet. All Harry could do was ask the questions that seemed most likely to provide useful information, even if Harry didn't yet have a plan. "So we just ask about whatever seems most interesting," said Harry's Ravenclaw side. "I'm up for that." "Shut up," Harry told the voice, and then, on further reflection, decided that he was no longer pretending it was there. 4 topics came to Harry's mind as being priorities from the standpoint of curiosity about important things. 4 questions, then, 4 major subjects, to try to fit in while this potion was still being brewed. 4 questions. "I ask my first question," Harry said. "What really happened on the night of October 31st, 1981? Why was that night different from all other nights? I would like the entire story, please." The question of how and why Lord Voldemort had survived his apparent death seemed likely to matter for future planning. "I expected you would ask that," Professor Quirrell said, dropping a bellflower and a white glittering stone into the potion. "To begin, everything I told you about the Horcrux spell is true, as you should realize, since I spoke in Parseltongue." Harry nodded. "Within seconds after you learned the details of the spell, you perceived the central flaw and began pondering how the spell might be improved. Do you think the young Tom Riddle was any different?" Harry shook his head. "Well, he was," said Professor Quirrell. "Whenever I was tempted to despair of you, I reminded myself how I was an idiot at twice your age. When I was 15, I made myself a Horcrux, as a certain book had shown me, using the death of Abigail Myrtle beneath the eyes of Slytherin's basilisk. I planned to make a new Horcrux every year after I left Hogwarts, and call that my fallback plan if my other hopes of immortality did not come to fruition. In retrospect, the young Tom Riddle was grasping straws. The thought of making a better Horcrux, of not being content with the spell I had already learned. This thought did not come to me until I had grasped the stupidity of ordinary people and realized which follies of theirs I had imitated. But in time, I learned the habit that you inherited from me, to ask in every instance how it might be done better. To be content with the spell I had learned from a book when it bore only a faint resemblance to what I truly wanted. Absurd. And so I set forth to create a better spell. You have true immortality now. Harry was aware that, even with everything else going on, this was a question more important than war and strategy. Indeed, said Professor Quirrell. He paused in his potions work and turned to face Harry fully. There was a look of exultation in the man's eyes that Harry had never seen there before. In all the darkest arts I could find, in all the interdicted secrets to which Slytherin's monster gave me keys, in all the lore remembered among wizard kind, I found only hints and smatterings of what I needed. So I rewove it and remade it, and devised a new ritual based on new principles. I kept that ritual burning in my mind for years, perfecting it in imagination, pondering its meaning and making fine adjustments, waiting for the intention to stabilize. At last I dared to invoke my ritual, an invented sacrificial ritual based on a principle untested by all known magic, and I lived and yet live. The defense professor spoke with quiet triumph, as though the act itself was so great that no words could ever do it justice. I still use the word Horcrux, but only from sentiment. It is a new thing entirely, the greatest of all my creations. As one of my questions you said you'd answer, I ask how to cast that spell, Harry said. Denied. The defense professor turned back to his potion, dropping in a grey-flecked white feather and a bellflower. I had thought perhaps to teach you when you were older, for no Tom Riddle would be content otherwise, but I have changed my mind. Memory is a hard thing to recall, sometimes, and Harry had been trying to remember if Professor Quirrell had dropped any hints about this subject before. Something about Professor Quirrell's phrasing sparked a memory. Perhaps you will be told when you are older. There are still physical anchors for your immortality, Harry said aloud. It resembles the old Horcrux spell by that much, which is another reason you still call them Horcruxes. It was dangerous to say aloud, but Harry needed to know. If I'm wrong, you can always deny it in Parseltongue. Professor Quirrell was smiling evilly. Your guess is right, boy, for all the good it does you. Unfortunately, that wasn't a difficult vulnerability to cover if the enemy was smart. Harry wouldn't ordinarily have made the suggestion, just in case the enemy hadn't thought of it for themselves, but in this case, he'd already made it. One Horcrux dropped into an active volcano, waited so it would sink into the Earth's mantle, Harry said heavily. The same place I thought of dropping the Dementor if I couldn't destroy it. And then you asked me where else I would hide something if I didn't want anyone to find it ever again. One Horcrux buried kilometers down, in an anonymous cubic meter of the Earth's crust. One Horcrux you dropped into the Mariana Trench. One Horcrux floating high in the stratosphere, transparent. Even you don't know where they are, because you obliviated the exact details from your memory. And the last Horcrux is the Pioneer 11 plaque that you snuck into NASA and modified. It's where you get your image of the stars when you cast the spell of starlight. Fire, earth, water, air, void. Something of a riddle, the defense professor had called it, and therefore Harry had remembered it. Something of a riddle. Indeed, said the defense professor. It did give me something of a shock when you remembered it that quickly, but I suppose it makes no difference. All five are beyond my reach or yours. That might not be true, especially if there was some way to trace the magical connection somehow and determine the location, though presumably Voldemort would have done his best to obscure it. But what magic had done, magic might be able to defeat. Pioneer 11 might be far away by wizard standards, but NASA knew exactly where it was, and it was probably a lot more reachable if you could use magic to tell the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation to bugger off. A sudden note of worry plucked at Harry's mind. There was no rule saying the defense professor needed to have told the truth about which interstellar probe he'd Horcruxed, and if Harry recalled correctly, communication and tracking of the Pioneer 10 probe had been lost shortly after the Jupiter flyby. Why wouldn't Professor Quirrell have just Horcruxed them both? The obvious next thought came to Harry. It was something that ought not to be suggested if the enemy had not thought of it, but it seemed extremely probable that the enemy had thought of it. Tell me, teacher, Harry hissed, would destroying Thas 5 anchors slay you? Why do you ask? Hissed the defense professor, with a lilt to the hiss that Parseltongue translated as snackish amusement. Do you suspect that answer is no? Harry couldn't think of how to answer, though he strongly suspected that it didn't matter in any case. Your suspicion is right, boy. Destroying Thas 5 would not render me mortal. Harry's throat felt a bit dry again. If the spell had no disastrous cost associated with it, how many anchors did you make? Would not ordinarily S say, but it's clear you have already guessed. The defense professor's smile widened. Answer is that I do not know. S stopped counting S somewhere around 100 and S7. S simply made a habit of it each time I murdered S someone in private. Over 100 murders in private before Lord Voldemort had stopped counting. And even worse news, your immortality spell still requires a human death. Why? Great creation maintains life and magic within devices created by S sacrificing life and magic of others. Again that hissing snake laughter. Liked false description of previous Horcrux S spell SSO much. SSO disappointed when realist truth of it, thoughts of improved version came out in that S shape. Harry wasn't sure why the defense professor was giving him all this vital information, but there had to be a reason, and that was making him nervous. So you really are a disembodied spirit possessing Quirinus Quirrell. Yes. I S shall return S swiftly if this S body is killed, will be greatly annoyed and vengeful. I am telling you this, boy, so that you do not try anything stupid. I understand, Harry said. He did his best to organize his thoughts, remember what he'd meant to ask next, while the defense professor turned his eyes back to the potion. The man's left hand was dribbling crushed seashell into the cauldron, while his right hand dropped in another bellflower. So what did happen on October 31st? You tried to turn the baby Harry Potter into a Horcrux, either the new kind or the old kind. You did it deliberately, because you told Lily Potter. Harry took a breath. Now that he knew why the chills were there, he could endure them. Very well, I accept the bargain. Yourself to die and the child to live. Now drop your wand so that I can murder you. In retrospect, it was clear that Harry had remembered that event mainly from Lord Voldemort's perspective, and only at the very end had he seen it through the baby Harry Potter's eyes. What did you do? Why did you do it? Trelawney's prophecy, Professor Quirrell said. His hand tapped a bellflower with a strip of copper before dropping it in. I spent long days pondering it after Snape brought the prophecy to me. Prophecies are never trivial things, and how shall I put this in a way that does not make you think stupid things? Well, I shall say it, and if you are stupid, I shall be annoyed. I was fascinated by the prophecy's assertion that someone would be my equal because it might mean that person could hold up the other end of an intelligent conversation. After 50 years of being surrounded by gibbering stupidity, I no longer cared whether my reaction might be considered a literary cliché. I was not about to pass up on that opportunity without thinking about it first. And then, you see, I had a clever idea. Professor Quirrell sighed. It occurred to me how I might fulfill the prophecy my own way, to my own benefit. I would mark the baby as my equal by casting the old Horcrux spell in such fashion as to imprint my own spirit onto the baby's blank slate. It would be a purer copy of myself, since there would be no old self to mix with the new. In some years, when I had become bored with ruling Britain and moved on to other things, I would arrange with the other Tom Riddle that he should appear to vanquish me, and he would rule over the Britain he had saved. We would play the game against each other forever, keeping our lives interesting amid a world of fools. I knew a dramatist would predict that the two of us would end by destroying each other, but I pondered long upon it and decided that both of us would simply decline to play out the drama. That was my decision, and I was confident that it would remain so. Both Tom Riddles, I thought, would be too intelligent to truly go down that road. The prophecy seemed to hint that if I destroyed all but a remnant of Harry Potter, then our spirits would not be so different, and we could exist in the same world. Something went wrong, Harry said. Something that blew off the top of the Potter's home in Godric's Hollow, gave me the scar on my forehead, and left your burnt body behind. Professor Quirrell nodded. His hands had slowed in their potions work. The resonance in our magic, Professor Quirrell said quietly. I had shaped the baby's spirit to be like my own. Harry remembered the moment in Azkaban when Professor Quirrell's killing curse had collided with his patroness. The burning, tearing agony in his forehead, like his head had been about to split in half. I cannot count how many times I have thought of that night, rehearsing my mistake, thinking of wiser things I should have done, said Professor Quirrell. I later decided that I should have thrown my wand from my hand and changed into my animagus form. But that night, That night, I instinctively tried to control the chaotic fluctuations in my magic, even as I felt myself burning up from inside. That was the wrong decision, and I failed. So my body was destroyed, even as I overwrote the infant Harry Potter's mind, either of us destroying all but a remnant of the other. And then, Professor Quirrell's expression was controlled. And then, when I regained consciousness inside my Horcruxes, it turned out that my great creation did not work as I had hoped. I should have been able to float free of my Horcruxes and possess any victim that consented to me, or that was too weak to refuse me. That was the part of my great creation that failed my intent. As with the original Horcrux spell, I would only be able to enter a victim who contacted the physical Horcrux. And I had hidden my unnumbered Horcruxes in places where nobody would ever find them. Your instinct is correct, boy. This would not be a good time to laugh. Harry stayed very quiet. The potions making had come to a temporary pause, a space where no ingredients were added while the cauldron simmered for a time. I spent most of my time looking at the stars, Professor Quirrell said, his voice quieter now. The defense professor had turned from the potion, staring at the white illuminated walls of the room. My remaining hope was the Horcruxes I had hidden in the hopeless idiocy of my youth, imbuing them into ancient lockets instead of anonymous pebbles, guarding them beneath wells of poison in the center of a lake of inferi instead of portkeying them into the sea. If someone found one of those and penetrated their ridiculous protections. But that seemed like a distant hope. I was not sure I would ever be embodied again. Yet at least I was immortal. The worst of all fates had been averted. My great creation had done that much. I had little left to hope for and little left to fear. I decided that I would not go insane, since there seemed to be no advantage in it. Instead, I gazed out at the stars and thought, as the sun slowly diminished behind me. I reflected on the errors of my past life. They were many in that hindsight. In my imagination, I constructed powerful new rituals I might attempt if I was free to use my magic once more, and yet confident of my immortality. I contemplated ancient riddles at greater length than before, for all that I had once thought myself patient. I knew that if I won free, I would be more powerful by far than in my previous life, but I mostly did not expect that to happen. Professor Quirrell turned back to the potion. 9 years and 4 months after that night, a wandering adventurer named Quirinus Quirrell won past the protections guarding one of my earliest Horcruxes. The rest you know. And now, boy, you may say what we both know you are thinking. Harry said. It doesn't seem like a very smart thing to say, indeed, Mr. Potter. It is not a clever thing to say to me, not even a little, not in the slightest. But I know you're thinking it, and you will go on thinking it, and I will go on knowing that until you say it. So speak. So, I realize that this is something that is more obvious in hindsight than in foresight, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you try to correct the error now. But if you are a Dark Lord, and you happen to hear about a child who has been prophesied to defeat you, there is a certain spell which is unblockable, unstoppable, and works every single time on anything with a brain. Yes, thank you, Mr. Potter. That thought occurred to me several times over the next 9 years. Professor Quirrell picked up another bellflower and began crumbling it in his bare fist. I made that principle the centerpiece of my battle magic curriculum after I learned its centrality the hard way. It was not the first rule on the younger Tom Riddle's list. It is only by harsh experience that we learn which principles take priority over which other principles. As mere words, they all sound equally persuasive. In retrospect, it would have been better if I had sent Bellatrix to the Potter's home in my place. But I had a rule telling me that for such matters I must go myself, and not try sending a trusted lieutenant. Yes, I considered the killing curse, but I wondered if casting the killing curse at an infant would somehow cause the curse to bounce off and hit me, thus fulfilling the prophecy. How was I to know? So use an axe. It's hard to get a prophecy-fulfilling spell backfire out of an axe, Harry said, and then shut up. I decided the safest path was to try to fulfill the prophecy on my own terms, Professor Quirrell said. Needless to say, the next time I hear a prophecy I do not like, I will tear it apart at every possible point of intervention, rather than trying to play along. Professor Quirrell was crushing a rose, as though to squeeze the juice out of it. still using his bare fist. And now everyone thinks the boy who lived is somehow immune to the killing curse, even though killing curses do not ruin houses or leave burnt bodies behind them, because it has not occurred to them that Lord Voldemort would ever use any other spell. Harry again stayed quiet. It had occurred to Harry that there was another obvious way that Lord Voldemort could have avoided his mistake, something that might perhaps be easier to see given a Muggle upbringing, instead of the wizarding way of looking at things. Harry had not yet decided whether to tell Professor Quirrell about his thought. There were both pros and cons to pointing out that particular error. After a time, Professor Quirrell picked up the next potion's ingredient, a strand of what looked like unicorn hair. "I tell you this as a caution," said Professor Quirrell. "Do not expect me to be delayed another 9 years if you somehow destroy this body of mine. I set Horcruxes in better places at once, and now even that is unnecessary. Thanks to you, I learned where to find the Resurrection Stone. The Resurrection Stone does not bring back the dead, of course, but it holds a more ancient magic than my own for projecting the seeming of a spirit. And since I am one who has defeated death, Cadmus's Hallow acknowledged me its master and answered all my will. I have now incorporated it into my great creation." Professor Quirrell smiled slightly. "I had many years earlier considered making that device a Horcrux, but decided against it at the time, since I realized that the ring had magic of unknown nature. Ah, such ironies does life play upon us. But I digress. You boy, you brought that about. You freed my spirit to fly where it pleases and seduce the most opportune victim by being too casual with your secrets. It is a catastrophe for any who oppose me, and you wrought it with one finger drawing wetness on a tea saucer. This world will be a safer place for all if you learn the rectitude that wizard-borns absorb in childhood, and all this that I have just said is the truth." Harry closed his eyes, and his own hand massaged his forehead. If he had seen it from the outside, it would have looked the mirror of Professor Quirrell in deep thought. The problem of defeating Professor Quirrell was looking increasingly difficult, even by the standards of the sort of impossible problems that Harry had solved already. If communicating that difficulty was what Professor Quirrell was trying to do, he was succeeding. Harry was starting to seriously consider the possibility that it might be better to offer to rule Britain as Voldemort's non-homicidal delegate if Professor Quirrell himself would just agree to stop killing people all the time, even mostly. But that wasn't likely to happen. Harry stared at his hands, from where he had sat down upon the floor, feeling sadness shading over into despair. The Lord Voldemort, who'd given Harry his dark side, had spent that long thinking things over and reflecting on his own thought processes, and had emerged as the calm, clear-headed, and still homicidal Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell added a pinch of golden hair to the potion of effulgence, and that reminded Harry that time was continuing to move. The locks of bright hair were rarer than the bellflowers. "I ask my second question," Harry said. "Tell me about the Philosopher's Stone. Does it do anything besides making transfigurations permanent? Is it possible to make more stones, and why is that problem hard?" Professor Quirrell was bent over the potion, and Harry could not see his face. "Very well, I shall tell you the stone's story as I have inferred it. The one and only power of the stone is the imposition of permanency, to render a temporary form into a true and lasting substance, a power absolutely beyond ordinary spells. Conjurations, such as the Castle Hogwarts, are maintained by a constant well of magic. Even Metamorph Magi cannot manifest golden fingernails and then trim them for sale. It is theorized that the Metamorph Magus curse merely rearranges the substance of their flesh, like a Muggle smith manipulates iron with hammer and tongs, and their body contains no gold. If Merlin himself could create gold from thin air, history does not record it. So the stone, we can guess even before research, must be a very old thing indeed. In contrast, Nicholas Flamel has been known to the world for a mere 6 centuries. Tell me the obvious next question to ask, boy, if you wanted to trace the stone's history." Harry said. He rubbed his forehead, concentrating. If the stone was old, but the world had only known Nicholas Flamel for 6 centuries. Was there some other very long-lived wizard who disappeared at around the same time Nicholas Flamel showed up? "Close," said Professor Quirrell. "You recall that 6 centuries ago there was a dark lady called Undying, the sorceress Baba Yaga. She was said to be able to heal any wound in herself, to change shape into any form she pleased. She held the stone of permanency, obviously. And then one year Baba Yaga agreed to teach battle magic at Hogwarts under an old and respected truce. Professor Quirrell looked angry, a look such as Harry had rarely seen on him. But she was not trusted, and so there was invoked a curse. Some curses are easier to cast when they bind yourself, and others alike. Slytherin's Parselmouth curse is an example of such. In this case, Baba Yaga's signature and signatures from every student and teacher of Hogwarts were placed within an ancient device known as the Goblet of Fire. Baba Yaga swore not to shed a drop of students' blood, nor take from the students anything that was theirs. In return, the student swore not to shed a drop of Baba Yaga's blood, nor take from her anything that was hers. So they all signed, with the Goblet of Fire to witness it and punish the transgressor. Professor Quirrell picked up a new ingredient, a loose thread of gold wrapped around a pinch of foul-looking substance. Entering her 6th year at Hogwarts, then, was a witch named Perenelle. And although Perenelle was newcome into the beauty of her youth, her heart was already blacker than Baba Yaga's own. "You're calling her evil," Harry said, then realized he had just committed the fallacy of ad hominem tu quoque. "Hush, boy, I am telling the story. Where was I? Ah, yes, Perenelle, the beautiful and covetous. Perenelle seduced the Dark Lady over the months, with gentle touches and flirtations and the shy pretense of innocence. The Dark Lady's heart was captured, and they became lovers. And then one night, Perenelle whispered how she had heard of Baba Yaga's shape-changing power, and how this thought had inflamed her desires. Thus Perenelle swayed Baba Yaga to come to her with the stone in hand, to assume many guises in a single night, for their pleasures. Among other forms, Perenelle bid Baba Yaga take the form of a man, and they lay together in the fashion of a man and a woman. But Perenelle had been a virgin until that night. And since they were all rather old-fashioned in those days, the Goblet of Fire accounted that as the shedding of Perenelle's blood, and the taking of what was hers. Thus Baba Yaga was tricked into being forsworn, and the goblet rendered her defenseless. Then Perenelle killed the unsuspecting Baba Yaga as she slept in Perenelle's bed, killed the Dark Lady who had loved her and come peacefully to Hogwarts under truce. And that was the end of the pact by which dark wizards and witches taught battle magic at Hogwarts. For the next few centuries, the Goblet of Fire was used to oversee pointless inter-school tournaments, and then it resided in a disused chamber at Beauxbatons, until I finally stole it. Professor Quirrell dropped a pale beige-pink twig into the cauldron, and its color changed to white just as it touched the surface. But I digress. Perenelle took the stone from Baba Yaga and assumed the guise and name of Nicholas Flamel. She also kept her identity as Perenelle, calling herself Flamel's wife. The two have appeared together in public, but that might be done by any number of obvious methods. "And the stone's manufacture," said Harry, his brain working to process all this. "I saw an alchemical recipe for it, in a book." Another lie. Perenelle was making it appear as though Nicholas Flamel had earned the right to live forever by completing a great magic that any could attempt, and she was giving others a false path to pursue, instead of seeking the one true stone as Perenelle had sought Baba Yaga's. Professor Quirrell looked rather sour. It should come as no surprise that I spent years trying to master that false recipe. Next you will ask why I did not kidnap, torture, and kill Perenelle after I learned the truth. This had not in fact been a question that had come into Harry's mind. Professor Quirrell continued to speak. The answer is that Perenelle had foreseen and forestalled the ambitions of dark wizards like myself. Nicholas Flamel publicly took unbreakable vows not to be coerced by any means into relinquishing his stone, to guard immortality from the covetous, he claimed, as if that were a public service. I was afraid the stone would be lost forever if Perenelle died without saying where it was hidden, and her vow prevented attempts at torture. Further, I had hopes of gaining Perenelle's knowledge if I could find the right strategy to extract it from her. Though Perenelle began with little lore of her own, she has held hostage the lives of wizards greater than herself, holding out dribs and drabs of healing in exchange for secrets, and small reversals of age in exchange for power. Perenelle does not condescend to bestow any real youth upon others, but if you hear of a wizard who lived, grey-bearded, to the age of 250, you may be sure that her hand was in play. By my own generation, the centuries had given Perenelle enough of an advantage that she could raise up Albus Dumbledore as a counterweight to the Dark Lord Grindelwald. When I appeared as Lord Voldemort, Perenelle raised up Dumbledore yet further, parceling out another drop of her hoarded lore whenever Lord Voldemort seemed to gain an advantage. I felt like I ought to be able to figure out something clever to do with that situation, but I never did. I did not attack her directly, for I was not sure of my great creation. It was not impossible that I would someday need to go begging to her for a dollop of reversed age. Professor Quirrell dropped 2 bellflowers at once into the potion, and they seemed to merge as they touched the bubbling liquid. But now I am sure of my creation, and so I have decided that the time has come to take the stone by force. Harry hesitated. I would like to hear you answer in Parseltongue. Was all of that true? None of it is known to me to be false, said Professor Quirrell. Telling a tale implies filling in certain gaps. I was not present to observe when Perenelle seduced Baba Yaga. The Basic's S should be mostly correct, I think. Harry had noticed a trace of confusion. Then, I don't understand why the stone is here in Hogwarts. Wouldn't the best defense just be hiding it under an anonymous rock in Greenland? Perhaps she respected my abilities as a particularly good finder, said the defense professor. He appeared focused on his cauldron as he dipped a bellflower into a jar of liquid labeled with the potion's symbol for rainwater. We are very much alike, the defense professor and I, in some ways if not others, if I imagine what I'd do given his problem. Did you bluff everyone into believing you had some way of finding the stone? Harry said aloud. So that Perenelle would put it inside Hogwarts, where Dumbledore could guard it. The defense professor sighed, not looking up from the cauldron. I suppose that stratagem would be futile to conceal from you. Yes, after I possessed Quirrell and returned, I implemented a strategy I had conceived while gazing at the stars. First, I made sure to be accepted as defense professor at Hogwarts, for it would not do to have suspicions raised while I was still seeking employment. When that was done, I arranged for one of Perenelle's curse-breaking expeditions to discover a falsified but credible inscription describing how the crown of the serpent could be used to seek out the stone wherever it was hidden. Immediately after, before Perenelle could buy up the crown, it was stolen. Furthermore, I left clear indications that the thief had possessed the power to speak to snakes. So Perenelle thought that I could infallibly find the stone's location, and that it needed a guardian powerful enough to defeat me. That is how the stone came to be held in Hogwarts, in Dumbledore's domain. Just as I intended, naturally, since I had already gained access to Hogwarts for the year. I think that is all of this that concerns you, if I speak not of future plans. Harry frowned. Professor Quirrell should not have told him that, unless the strategy had somehow become irrelevant to any future deception of Perenelle, or unless, by answering so quickly, the defense professor had hoped to have people conclude that it was a double bluff, and that the crown of the serpent really could find the stone. Harry decided not to question this answer in Parseltongue. Another lock of bright hair, seeming white but not with age, was gently dribbled into the cauldron, again reminding Harry that they were on a time limit. Harry considered, but he couldn't see any further path to pursue this line of questioning. There was no known way to manufacture more philosopher's stones, and no obvious way to invent such, which was probably the objectively worst news Harry had heard all day. Harry took a deep breath. I ask my third question, Harry said. The truth behind this entire school year, all the plots you ran, all the plots you know about. Said Professor Quirrell, dropping another bellflower into the potion, accompanied by a plant shaped like a tiny cross. Let me see. The most shocking twist is that the defense professor turns out to be secretly Voldemort. Well, obviously, Harry said, with a good deal of self-directed bitterness. Then where do you wish me to start? Why did you kill Hermione? The question just slipped out. Professor Quirrell's pale eyes glanced up from the potion, watched him intently. One would think that should be evident, but I suppose I cannot blame you for distrusting what seems evident. To understand the object of an obscure plot, observe its consequences, and ask who might have intended them. I killed Miss Granger to improve your position relative to that of Lucius Malfoy, since my plans did not call for him to have so much leverage over you. I admit I am impressed by how far you managed to parlay that opening. Harry unclenched his teeth, which took an effort. That's after your failed attempt to frame Hermione for the attempted murder of Draco and send her to Azkaban because of why. Because you didn't like the influence she was having on me. Don't be ridiculous, Professor Quirrell said. If I had only wished to remove Miss Granger, I would not have brought the Malfoys into it. I observed your game with Draco Malfoy and found it amusing, but I knew it could not continue for very long before Lucius learned and intervened. And then your folly would have brought you great trouble, for Lucius would not take it lightly. Had you just been able to lose during the Wisengamot trial, lose as I had taught you, then in only 2 more weeks, ironclad evidence would have shown that Lucius Malfoy, after discovering his son's seeming perfidy, had imperiused Professor Sprout into using the blood-cooling charm on Mr. Malfoy and casting the false memory charm on Miss Granger. Lucius would have been swept off the political game board, sent to exile if not Azkaban. Draco Malfoy would have inherited the wealth of House Malfoy, and your influence over him would have been unchallenged. Instead, I had to abort that plot in mid-course. You managed to completely disrupt the real plan in the course of sacrificing double your entire fortune, by giving Lucius Malfoy the perfect opportunity to prove his true concern for his son. You have an incredible anti-talent for meddling, I must say. And you also thought, Harry said, even with his dark side's patterns, he had to work to keep his voice level and cool, that 2 weeks in Azkaban would improve Miss Granger's disposition and get her to stop being a bad influence on me. So you somehow arranged for there to be newspaper stories calling for her to be sent to Azkaban rather than some other penalty. Professor Quirrell's lips drew up in a thin smile. Good catch, boy. Yes, I thought she might serve as your Bellatrix. That particular outcome would also have provided you with a constant reminder of how much respect was due the law and helped you develop appropriate attitudes toward the ministry. Your plot was stupidly complicated and had no chance of working. Harry knew he ought to be more tactful, that he was engaging in more of what Professor Quirrell called folly, but in that instant he could not bring himself to care. It was less complicated than Dumbledore's plot to have the 3 armies tie in the Christmas battle, and not much more complicated than my own plot to make you think Dumbledore had blackmailed Mr. Zabini. The insight you are missing, Mr. Potter, is that these were not plots that needed to succeed. Professor Quirrell continued to casually stir the potion, smiling. There are plots that must succeed, where you keep the core idea as simple as possible and take every precaution. There are also plots where it is acceptable to fail, and with those you can indulge yourself or test the limits of your ability to handle complications. It was not as if something going wrong with any of those plots would have killed me. Professor Quirrell was no longer smiling. Our journey into Azkaban was of the first type, and I was less amused by your antics there. What exactly did you do to Hermione? Some part of Harry wondered at the evenness of his voice. Obliviations and false memory charms. I could not trust anything else to go undetected by the Hogwarts wards and the scrutiny I knew her mind would undergo. A flicker of frustration crossed Professor Quirrell's face. Part of what you rightly call complication is because the first version of my plot did not go as planned, and I had to modify it. I came to Miss Granger in the hallways wearing the appearance of Professor Sprout to offer her a conspiracy. My first attempt at suasion failed. I obliviated her and tried again with a new presentation. The second bait failed. The third bait failed. The 10th bait failed. I was so frustrated that I began going through my entire library of guises, including those more appropriate to Mr. Zabini. Still nothing worked. The child would not violate her childish code. You do not get to call her childish, Professor. Harry's voice sounded strange in his own ears. Her code worked. It prevented you from tricking her. The whole point of having deontological ethical injunctions is that arguments for violating them are often much less trustworthy than they look. You don't get to criticize her rules when they worked exactly as intended. After they resurrected Hermione, Harry would tell her that Lord Voldemort himself hadn't been able to tempt her into doing wrong, and that was why he'd killed her. Fair enough, I suppose, said Professor Quirrell. There is a saying that even a stopped clock is right twice a day, and I do not think Miss Granger was actually being reasonable. Still, Rule 10. One must not rant about the opposition's unworthiness after they have foiled you. Regardless, after 2 full hours of failed attempts, I realized that I was being over-stubborn, and that I did not need Miss Granger to carry out the exact part I had planned for her. I gave up on my original intent, and instead imbued Miss Granger with false memories of watching Mr. Malfoy plotting against her under circumstances that implied she should not tell you or the authorities. In the end, it was Mr. Malfoy who gave me the opening I needed, entirely by luck. Professor Quirrell dropped a bellflower and a scrap of parchment into the cauldron. Why did the wards show the defense professor as having killed Hermione? I wore the mountain troll as a false tooth, while Dumbledore was identifying me to the Hogwarts wards as the defense professor. A slight smile. Other living weapons cannot be transfigured. They will not survive the disenchantment for the requisite 6 hours to avoid being traced by Time Turner. The fact that a mountain troll was used as a weapon of assassination was a clear sign that the assassin had needed a proxy weapon that could be transfigured safely. Combined with the evidence of the wards and Dumbledore's own knowledge of how he had identified me to Hogwarts, you could have deduced who was responsible, in theory. However, experience has taught me that such puzzles are far harder to solve when you do not already know the solution, and I considered it a small risk. Ah, that reminds me, I have a question of my own. The defense professor was now giving Harry an intent look. What gave me away at the last, in the corridor outside these chambers? Harry put aside other emotions to weigh up the cost and benefit of answering honestly, came to the conclusion that the defense professor was giving away far more information than he was getting. Why? And that it was best not to give the appearance of reticence. The main thing, Harry said, was that it was too improbable that everyone had arrived in Dumbledore's corridor at the same time. I tried running with the hypothesis that everyone who arrived had to be coordinated, including you. But I had said that I was following Snape, the defense professor said. Was that not plausible? It was, but, Harry said, the laws governing what constitutes a good explanation don't talk about plausible excuses you hear afterward. They talk about the probabilities we assign in advance. That's why science makes people do advanced predictions instead of trusting explanations people come up with afterward. And I wouldn't have predicted in advance for you to follow Snape and show up like that. Even if I'd known in advance that you could put a trace on Snape's wand, I wouldn't have expected you to do it and follow him just then. Since your explanation didn't make me feel like I would have predicted the outcome in advance, it remained an improbability. I started to wonder if Sprout's mastermind might have arranged for you to show up, too. And then I realized the note to myself hadn't really come from future me, and that gave it away completely. Ah, said the defense professor and sighed. Well, I think it is all working out for the best. You did understand only too late, and there would have been inconveniences as well as benefits to you remaining unaware. What on earth were you trying to do? The reason I was trying so hard to figure it out was that the whole thing was just so weird. That should have pointed at Dumbledore, not myself, said Professor Quirrell, and frowned. The fact is that Miss Greengrass was not supposed to arrive in that corridor for several hours. Though I suppose, since I did have Mr. Malfoy give her the clue I assigned her, it is not too surprising they banded together. Had Mr. not arrived seemingly alone, events would have played out less farcically. But I consider myself a specialist in battlefield control magics, and I was able to ensure that the fight went as I wished. I suppose it did end up looking a bit ridiculous. The defense professor dropped a peach slice and a bellflower into the cauldron. But let us defer our discussion of the mirror until we reach it. Did you have any more questions concerning Miss Granger's regrettable and hopefully temporary demise? Yes, Harry said in an even voice. What did you do to the Weasley twins? Dumbledore thought. The school saw the headmaster go to the Weasley twins after Hermione was arrested. Dumbledore thought you, as Voldemort, had wondered why Dumbledore had done so, and that you'd checked on the Weasley twins, found and took their map, and obliviated them afterward. Dumbledore was quite correct, Professor Quirrell said, shaking his head as though in wonderment. He was also an utter fool to leave the Hogwarts map in the possession of those two idiots. I had an unpleasant shock after I recovered the map. It showed my name and yours correctly. The Weasley idiots had thought it a mere malfunction, especially after you received your cloak and your time turner. If Dumbledore had kept the map himself, if the Weasleys had ever spoken of it to Dumbledore, But they did not, thankfully. Showed my name and yours correctly. I would like to see that, Harry said. Without taking his eyes from the cauldron, Professor Quirrell drew a folded parchment from within his robes, hissed at it, SORS surroundings, and tossed the folded parchment toward Harry. It cut unerringly through the air, an increase of doom breathing on Harry's senses as it moved toward him, and then it fluttered gently to Harry's feet. Harry picked up the parchment and unfolded it. At first the parchment seemed blank. Then, as though an unseen pen were moving across it, the outline of walls and doors appeared, all drawn in handwritten lines. The writing outlined a series of chambers, most of them shown as empty. The last chamber in the series had a confused scribble in its center, as though the map were trying to indicate its own bewilderment, and the second-to-last chamber showed two names within, written in positions within the chamber corresponding to where Harry was sitting and Professor Quirrell was standing. Tom M. Riddle. Tom M. Riddle. Harry gazed at the parchment, an unpleasant chill coming over him. It was one thing to hear Lord Voldemort claim that your name was Tom Riddle. It was another thing to find that Hogwarts's magic agreed. Did you tamper with this S-map to achieve this S-result, or did it appear before you by S-suppress? Was S-suppress, replied Professor Quirrell, with an overtone of hissing laughter. No tricks. Harry folded the map and threw it back in Professor Quirrell's direction. Some force caught it in midair before it reached the floor and drew the map back into Professor Quirrell's robes. The defense professor spoke. I should also like to volunteer that Snape was guiding Miss Granger and her underlings toward bullies and sometimes intervening to protect them. I knew that. Interesting, said Professor Quirrell. Did Dumbledore also learn of this? Answer in Parseltongue. Not SSO far as I know, hissed Harry. Fascinating, said Professor Quirrell. You may be interested to know this as well. Potions Maker had to work in S-Secret because his plot outpassed S-Schoolmaster's plot. Harry thought about this, while Professor Quirrell blew on the potion as though to cool it, though the fire still burned under the cauldron, then added a pinch of dirt and a drop of water and a bellflower. Please explain, Harry said. It never occurred to you to wonder why Dumbledore chose Severus Snape as the head of House Slytherin. To say that it was a cover for his work as Dumbledore's spy explains nothing. Snape could have been a potions master only, and not the head of Slytherin at all. Snape could have been made keeper of grounds and keys if he needed to stay within Hogwarts. Why the head of House Slytherin? Surely it occurred to you that this could not have good effects upon the Slytherins, according to Dumbledore's moral pretenses. The thought hadn't occurred to Harry in exactly those terms, no. I wondered something like it. I didn't put the dilemma in that precise form. And now that you have, is the solution obvious? No, Harry said. Disappointing. You have not learned enough cynicism. You have not grasped the flexibility of what moralists call morality. To fathom a plot, look at the consequences and ask if they might be intended. Dumbledore was deliberately sabotaging Slytherin House. Don't give me that look. Boy, I am speaking truth. During the last Wizarding War, Slytherins filled out my ranks of underlings, and other Slytherins in the Wisengamot supported me. Look at it from Dumbledore's perspective, and remember that he has no native understanding of Slytherin's ways. Think of Dumbledore becoming increasingly sad over this Hogwarts house that seems the source of so much ill-doing. And then behold, Dumbledore puts in as head of Slytherin the person of Snape. Snape, Severus Snape, a man who would teach his house neither cunning nor ambition, a man who would impose lax discipline and make its children weak, a man who would offend students of other houses, who would ruin Slytherin's name among them, a man whose surname was unknown in magical Britain and certainly not noble, who went about half in rags. Do you think Dumbledore ignorant of the consequence? When Dumbledore was the one who brought it about and had motive to bring it about, I expect Dumbledore told himself that more lives would be saved during the next Wizarding War if Voldemort's future Death Eaters were weakened. Professor Quirrell dropped into the cauldron a chip of ice, slowly melting as it touched the surface froth. Continue the process long enough, and no child would want to go to Slytherin. The house would be retired, and if the hat kept calling the name, it would become a mark of ignominy among children who would afterward be distributed among the other 3 houses. From that day on, Hogwarts would have 3 upstanding houses of courage and scholarship and industry, with no house of bad children added to the mix. just as if the three founders of Hogwarts had been wise enough in the beginning to refuse Salazar Slytherin their company. That, I expect, was Dumbledore's intended endgame, a short-term sacrifice for the greater good. Professor Quirrell smiled sardonically, and Lucius let it all happen without protest, or even, I expect, noticing that anything was going awry. I fear that in my absence my former servants have been quite outmatched in this battle of wits. Harry was having a bit of trouble taking this in, but decided, after some thought, that now was not the time to try to work it out. Whether Lord Voldemort believed it was not decisive, Harry would have to evaluate this accusation on his own. Professor Quirrell's mention of his servants had reminded Harry of something else that he was obligated, Harry supposed, to ask. The bad news was predictable. On any other day it would have been horrible. Today it would just wash out in the flood. Bellatrix Black, Harry said. What was the truth about her? She was broken inside before I ever met her, Professor Quirrell said. He picked up what looked like a white-grey rubber band and held it over the cauldron. As the rubber was held within the steam, it turned black. Using legilimency on her was a mistake, but that glimpse showed me how easy it would be to make her fall in love with me, so I did. Ever after she was the most faithful of all my servants, the only one I could almost trust. I had no intention of giving her what she wanted from me, so I commended her to the Lestrange brothers for their use, and the three of them were happy in their own special way. I doubt it, Harry's mouth said, mostly on autopilot. If that were true, Bellatrix wouldn't have remembered who the Lestrange brothers were when we found her in Azkaban. Professor Quirrell shrugged. You may be right. What the hell were we actually doing there? Finding out where Bellatrix had put my wand. I had told the Death Eaters of my immortality, in the hope, now proven futile, that they would stay together for at least a few days if I appeared to die. Bellatrix's instructions were to recover my wand from wherever my body had been slain, and take that wand to a certain graveyard where my spirit would appear before her. Harry swallowed. The image came to him of Bellatrix Black waiting at the graveyard, in increasing desperation. It was no wonder she hadn't been thinking strategically when she attacked the Longbottom household. What did you do with Bellatrix once she was out? S sent her to a peaceful place to recover S strength, Professor Quirrell said, a cold smile. I had a use remaining for her, or rather a certain portion of her, and on my future plans I shall not answer questions. Harry breathed deeply, trying to maintain control. Were there any other secret plots in this school year? Oh, a fair number, but not many more that concern you, not that I can think of offhand. The true reason I demanded to try to teach the Patronus charm to first years was to bring a Dementor before your own person, and then I arranged for your wand to fall where the Dementor could continue to drain you through it. Was no malice in it, only hopes that you would recover some of your true memories. That was also why I arranged for certain witches to pull you down from the air during your rooftop episode, so I could appear to save your life. Just in case any suspicion fell on me during the Dementor incident I had scheduled for shortly after. Also no malice there. I arranged some of the attacks on Miss Granger's group so that the attacks could be defeated. I do rather dislike bullies. Think that is all secret plots concerning you from this school year, unless I have forgotten something. Life lesson learned, said his Hufflepuff. Try to resist the temptation to randomly meddle in other people's lives. Like Padma Patel's life. If you don't want to end up like this, that is. A pinch of red-brown dust was gently sifted into the potion's cauldron, and Harry asked his fourth and final question, the one that had seemed to have the lowest priority but still mattered. What was your objective during the Wizarding War? Harry said. I mean, what? His voice wobbled. What was the point of the entire thing? His brain repeating endlessly, why, Lord Voldemort? Professor Quirrell lifted an eyebrow. They told you about David Monroe, did they not? Yes, you were both David Monroe and Lord Voldemort during the Wizarding War. I understood that part. You killed David Monroe, disguised yourself as him, and wiped out David Monroe's family so they wouldn't notice any differences. Indeed. You planned to control whichever side won the Wizarding War, regardless of which side won. But why did one side have to be Voldemort? I mean, wouldn't it have been easier to gain public support with someone less? With someone less Voldemort? Professor Quirrell's mallet made an unusually loud thud as it crushed white butterfly wings, mixing them with another bellflower. I planned. Professor Quirrell said harshly, for Lord Voldemort to lose to David Monroe. The flaw in that strategy was the absolute wretchedness of Professor Quirrell stopped. No, I am telling the tale out of order. Listen, boy, when I had devised my great creation and come into the fullness of my magic, I thought the time had come for me to take political power into my hands. It would be inconvenient, certainly, and take up my time in ways that were not enjoyable. But I knew the Muggles would eventually destroy the world, or make war on wizard kind, or both, and something had to be done if I was not to wander a dead or dull world through my eternity. Having attained immortality, I needed a new ambition to occupy my decades, and to prevent the Muggles from ruining everything seemed a goal of acceptable scope and difficulty. It is a source of continual amusement to me that I, of all people, am the only one really taking action towards that end. Though I suppose it would make sense for the mortal insects not to care about their world's end. Why should they, when they are just going to die regardless, and can save themselves the inconvenience of trying to do anything difficult along the way? But I digress. I saw how Dumbledore had risen to power from his defeat of Grindelwald, so I thought I would do the same. I had long ago taken my vengeance on David Monroe. He was an annoyance from my year in Slytherin, so I bethought to also steal his identity and wipe out his family to make myself heir of his house. And I conceived also a great foe for David Monroe to fight, the most terrifying Dark Lord imaginable, clever beyond reckoning, more dangerous by far than Grindelwald, for his intelligence would be perfected in all the ways that Grindelwald had been flawed and self-destructive. A Dark Lord who would do his cunning utmost to disrupt the alliances who would fight him, a Dark Lord who would command the deepest loyalty from his followers through his oratical skills. The most dreadful Dark Lord who had ever threatened Britain or the world, that was who David Monroe would defeat. Professor Quirrell's mallet struck a bellflower, and then a different pale flower with two more thuds. But then, while I had sometimes played the part of dark wizard in my wanderings, I had never adopted the identity of a full-fledged Dark Lord with underlings and a political agenda. I had no practice at the task, and I was mindful of the story of Dark Evangel and the disaster of her first public appearance. According to what she said afterward, she had meant to call herself the Walking Catastrophe and the Apostle of Darkness, but in the excitement of the moment, she introduced herself as the Apostrophe of Darkness instead. After that, she had to ruin 2 entire villages before anyone took her seriously. So you decided to try a small-scale experiment first, Harry said. A sickness rose up in him, because in that moment Harry understood, he saw himself reflected. The next step was just what Harry himself would have done if he'd had no trace of ethics whatsoever, if he'd been that empty inside. You created a disposable identity to learn how the ropes worked and get your mistakes out of the way. Indeed. Before becoming a truly terrible Dark Lord for David Monroe to fight, I first created for practice the persona of a Dark Lord with glowing red eyes, pointlessly cruel to his underlings, pursuing a political agenda of naked personal ambition combined with blood purism as argued by drunks in Knockturn Alley. My first underlings were hired in a tavern, given cloaks and skull masks, and told to introduce themselves as Death Eaters. The sixth sense of understanding deepened in the pit of Harry's stomach, and you called yourself Voldemort. Just so, General Chaos. Professor Quirrell was grinning from where he stood by the cauldron. I wanted it to be an anagram of my name, but that would only have worked if I'd conveniently been given the middle name of Marvolo, and then it would have been a stretch. Our actual middle name is Morphin, if you're curious, but I digress. I thought Voldemort's career would last only a few months, a year at the longest, before the auras brought down his underlings and the disposable Dark Lord vanished. As you perceive, I had vastly overestimated my competition, and I could not quite bring myself to torture my underlings when they brought me bad news, no matter what Dark Lords did in plays. I could not quite manage to argue the tenets of blood purism as incoherently as if I were a drunk in Knockturn Alley. I was not trying to be clever when I sent my underlings on their missions, but neither did I give them entirely pointless orders. Professor Quirrell gave a rueful grin that, in another context, might have been called charming. 1 month after that, Bellatrix Black prostrated herself before me, And after 3 months, Lucius Malfoy was negotiating with me over glasses of expensive fire whiskey. I sighed, gave up all hope for wizard kind, and began as David Monroe to oppose this fearsome Lord Voldemort. And then, what happened? A snarl contorted Professor Quirrell's face. The absolute inadequacy of every single institution in the civilization of magical Britain is what happened. You cannot comprehend it, boy. I cannot comprehend it. It has to be seen, and even then it cannot be believed. You will have observed, perhaps, that of your fellow students who speak of their families' occupations, 3 in 4 seem to mention jobs in some part or another of the ministry. You will wonder how a country can manage to employ 3 of its 4 citizens in bureaucracy. The answer is that if they did not all prevent each other from doing their jobs, none of them would have any work left to do. The Aurors were competent as individual fighters. They did fight dark wizards, and only the best survived to train new recruits, but their leadership was in absolute disarray. The ministry was so busy routing papers that the country had no effective opposition to Voldemort's attacks except myself, Dumbledore, and a handful of untrained irregulars. A shiftless, incompetent, cowardly layabout, Mundungus Fletcher, was considered a key asset in the Order of the Phoenix, because, being otherwise unemployed, he did not need to juggle another job. I tried weakening Voldemort's attacks to see if it was possible for him to lose. At once the ministry committed fewer Aurors to oppose me. I had read Mao's little red book. I had trained my Death Eaters in guerrilla tactics. For nothing. For nothing. I was attacking all of magical Britain, and in every engagement, my forces outnumbered their opposition. In desperation, I ordered my Death Eaters to systematically assassinate every single incompetent managing the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. One paper pusher after another volunteered to accept higher positions despite the fate of their predecessors, gleefully rubbing their hands at the prospect of promotion. Every one of them thought they would cut a deal with Lord Voldemort on the side. It took 7 months to murder our way through them all, and not a single Death Eater asked why we were bothering. And then, even with Bartemius Crouch risen to director and Amelia Bones as head Auror, it was still too little. I could have done better fighting alone. Dumbledore's aid was not worth his moral restraints, and Crouch's aid was not worth his respect for the law. Professor Quirrell turned up the fire beneath the potion. And eventually, Harry said through the heart sickness, you realized you were just having more fun as Voldemort. It is the least annoying role I have ever played. If Lord Voldemort says that something is to be done, people obey him and do not argue. I did not have to suppress my impulse to cruciate people being idiots. For once it was all part of the role. If someone was making the game less pleasant for me, I just said Avadake, ever regardless of whether that was strategically wise, and they never bothered me again. Professor Quirrell casually chopped a small worm into bits. But my true epiphany came on a certain day when David Monroe was trying to get an entry permit for an Asian instructor in combat tactics, and a ministry clerk denied it, smiling smugly. I asked the ministry clerk if he understood that this measure was meant to save his life, and the ministry clerk only smiled more. Then in fury I threw aside masks and caution. I used my legilimency. I dipped my fingers into the cesspit of his stupidity and tore out the truth from his mind. I did not understand, and I wanted to understand. With my command of legilimency, I forced his tiny clerk brain to live out alternatives, seeing what his clerk brain would think of Lucius Malfoy, or Lord Voldemort, or Dumbledore standing in my place. Professor Quirrell's hands had slowed, as he delicately peeled bits and small strips from a chunk of candle wax. What I finally realized that day is complicated, boy, which is why I did not understand it earlier in life. To you I shall try to describe it anyway. Today I know that Dumbledore does not stand at the top of the world, for all that he is the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation. People speak ill of Dumbledore openly, they criticize him proudly, and to his face, in a way they would not dare stand up to Lucius Malfoy. You have acted disrespectfully toward Dumbledore, boy. Do you know why you did so? I'm not sure, Harry said. Having Tom Riddle's leftover neural patterns was certainly an obvious hypothesis. Wolves, dogs, even chickens fight for dominance among themselves. What I finally understood from that clerk's mind was that to him Lucius Malfoy had dominance, Lord Voldemort had dominance, and David Monroe and Albus Dumbledore did not. By taking the side of good, by professing to abide in the light, we had made ourselves unthreatening. In Britain, Lucius Malfoy has dominance, for he can call in your loans, or send ministry bureaucrats against your shop, or crucify you in the Daily Prophet if you go openly against his will. And the most powerful wizard in the world has no dominance, because everyone knows that he is, Professor Quirrell's lips curled, a hero out of stories, relentlessly self-effacing and too humble for vengeance. Tell me, child, have you ever seen a drama where the hero, before he consents to save his country, demands so much gold as a barrister might receive for a court case? Actually, there have been a lot of heroes like that in Muggle fiction. I'll name Han Solo just to start. Well, in magical drama it is not so. It is all humble heroes like Dumbledore. It is the fantasy of the powerful slave who will never truly rise above you, never demand your respect, never even ask you for pay. You understand now? I think so, Harry said. Frodo and Samwise from Lord of the Rings did seem to match the archetype of a completely non-threatening hero. You're saying that's how people think of Dumbledore. I don't believe the Hogwarts students see him as a hobbit. In Hogwarts, Dumbledore does punish certain transgressions against his will, so he is feared to some degree, though the students still make free to mock him in more than whispers. Outside this castle, Dumbledore is sneered at. They began to call him mad, and he aped the part like a fool. Step into the role of a savior out of plays, and people see you as a slave to whose services they are entitled, and whom it is their enjoyment to criticize. For it is the privilege of masters to sit back and call forth helpful corrections while the slaves labor. Only in the tales of the ancient Greeks, from when men were less sophisticated in their delusions, may you see the hero who is also high. Hector, Aeneas, those were heroes who retained their right of vengeance upon those who insulted them, who could demand gold and jewels in payment for their services without sparking indignation. And if Lord Voldemort conquered Britain, he might then condescend to show himself noble in victory, and nobody would take his goodwill for granted, nor chirp corrections at him if his work was not to their liking. When he won, he would have true respect. I understood that day in the ministry that by envying Dumbledore, I had shown myself as deluded as Dumbledore himself. I understood that I had been trying for the wrong place all along. You should know this to be true, boy, for you have made freer to speak ill of Dumbledore than you ever dared speak ill of me. Even in your own thoughts, I wager, for instinct runs deep. You knew that it might be to your cost to mark the strong and vengeful Professor Quirrell, but that there was no cost in disrespecting the weak and harmless Dumbledore. Thank you, Harry said through the pain. For that valuable lesson, Professor Quirrell, I see that you are right about what my mind was doing. Though Tom Riddle's memories had probably also had something to do with the way he had sometimes lashed out at Dumbledore for no good reason, Harry hadn't been like that around Professor McGonagall, who admittedly had the power to deduct house points and didn't have Dumbledore's air of tolerance. No, it was still true. Harry would have been more respectful even in his own thoughts if Dumbledore had not seemed safe to disrespect. So that had been David Monroe, and that had been Lord Voldemort. It still hadn't answered the most puzzling question, and Harry wasn't sure that asking it would be wise. If somehow Lord Voldemort had managed not to think of it, and then Professor Quirrell had still managed not to think of it during 9 years of contemplation, then it wasn't wise to say. Or maybe it was. The agonies of the Wizarding War had not been good for Britain. Harry decided, and spoke. One thing that did confuse me was why the Wizarding War lasted so long, Harry ventured. I mean, maybe I'm underestimating the difficulties that were facing Lord Voldemort. You want to know why I did not imperious some of the stronger wizards who could imperious others, slay the very strongest wizards who could have resisted my imperious, and take over the ministry in, perhaps 3 days. Harry nodded silently. Professor Quirrell looked contemplative. His hand was sifting grass clippings into the cauldron, bit by bit. That ingredient, if Harry remembered correctly, was something like 4/5 towards the end of the recipe. I wondered that myself, the defense professor said finally, when I heard Trelawney's prophecy from Snape, and I contemplated the past as well as the future. If you had asked my past self why he did not use the Imperius, he would have spoken of the need to be seen to rule, to openly command the ministry bureaucracy, before it was time to turn his eyes outward to other countries. He would have remarked on how a quick and silent victory might bring challenges later. He would have remarked on the obstacle presented by Dumbledore and his incredible defensive prowess. And he would have had similar excuses for every other quick path he considered. Somehow it was never the right time to bring my plans to their final phase. There was always one more thing to do first. Then I heard the prophecy, and I knew that it was time, for time itself was taking notice of me. That the span for hesitation was done, and I looked back and realized somehow this had been going on for years. I think the occasional bit of grass was still dropping down from his hand, but Professor Quirrell did not seem to pay it any mind. I thought, when I was contemplating my past beneath the starlight, that I had become too accustomed to playing against Dumbledore. Dumbledore was intelligent. He tried diligently to be cunning. He did not wait for me to strike, but presented me with surprises. He made bizarre moves that played out in fascinating and unpredictable ways. In retrospect, there were many obvious plans for destroying Dumbledore, but I think some part of me did not want to go back to playing solitaire instead of chess. It was when I had the prospect of creating another Tom Riddle to plot against, someone even more worthy than Dumbledore, that I was first willing to contemplate the end of my war. Yes, in retrospect that sounds stupid, but sometimes our emotions are more foolish than we can bring our reason to admit. I would never have espoused such a policy deliberately. It would have violated Rules 9, 16, 20, and 22, and that is too much even if you are enjoying yourself. But to repeatedly decide that there was one more thing left to be done, one more advantage left to be gained, one more piece that I simply had to move into place, before abandoning an enjoyable time in my life and moving on to the more tedious rulership of Britain. Well, even I am not immune to a mistake like that, if I do not realize that I am making it. And that was when Harry knew what was going to happen at the end of this, after the Philosopher's Stone had been retrieved. At the end of this, Professor Quirrell was going to kill him. Professor Quirrell didn't want to kill him. It was possible that Harry was the only person in the world against whom Professor Quirrell wouldn't be able to use a killing curse. But Professor Quirrell thought he had to do it, for whatever reason. That was why Professor Quirrell had decided that it was necessary to brew the potion of effulgence the long way. That was why Professor Quirrell had been so easily negotiated into answering these questions, into finally talking about his life with someone who might understand. Just like Lord Voldemort had delayed the end of the Wizarding War to play longer against Dumbledore. Harry couldn't exactly recall what Professor Quirrell had said earlier about not killing Harry. It hadn't been anything straightforward along the lines of, I am absolutely not planning to kill you in any way, shape, or form, unless you positively insist on doing something stupid. Harry had been reluctant himself to push the promise too far and insist on unambiguous terms, because Harry had already known that he would need to neutralize Lord Voldemort and had expected more precise language to reveal that fact if they tried to exchange truly binding promises. So there certainly would have been loopholes, whatever had been said. There was no particular shock to the realization, just an increased sense of urgency. Some part of Harry had already known this, and had simply been waiting for an excuse to make it known to deliberation. There had been too many things said here that Professor Quirrell would not reveal to anyone with an expected lifespan measured in more than hours. The overwhelming isolation and loneliness of the life Professor Quirrell had described might explain why he was willing to violate his rules and talk with Harry, given that Harry was going to die soon, and that the world did not actually work like a play where the villain disclosing his plans would always fail to kill the hero afterward. But Harry's death certainly had to be in those future plans somewhere. Harry swallowed, controlling his breathing. Professor Quirrell had just added a tuft of horsehair to the potion of effulgence, and that was very late in the potion, if Harry remembered correctly. There weren't many bellflowers left in the heap to be added, either. It was probably time to stop worrying so much about risk and play this conversation less conservatively, all things considered. If I point out one of Lord Voldemort's mistakes, Harry said, does he punish me for it? Professor Quirrell lifted his eyebrows. Not if the mistake is a real one. I do not suggest that you moralize at me, but I would not curse the bearer of bad news, nor the subordinate who makes an honest attempt to point out a problem. Even as Lord Voldemort, I could never bring myself to that stupidity. Of course, there were some fools who mistook my policy for weakness, who tried to thrust themselves forward by pushing me down in their public council, thinking me obliged to tolerate it as criticism. Professor Quirrell smiled reminiscently. The Death Eaters were better off without them, and I do not advise you make the same mistake. Harry nodded, a slight shiver going through him. When you told me about what happened in Godric's Hollow on Halloween night in 1981, I thought I saw another flaw in your reasoning, a way you could have avoided disaster. But I think you have a blind spot, a class of strategies you don't consider, so you didn't see it even afterward. I hope you are not about to say anything stupid along the lines of don't try to kill people, Professor Quirrell said. I shall be unhappy if that is the case. Not value as difference. True mistake, given your goals. Will you hurt me if I act the part of the teacher toward you and teach lesson, or if mistake is as simple and obvious and make us you feel as stupid? No, hissed Professor Quirrell. Not if lesson is true. Harry swallowed. Why didn't you test the Horcrux system before you actually had to use it? Test it, said Professor Quirrell. He looked up from the brewing potion, and indignation came into his voice. What do you mean, test it? Why didn't you test if the Horcrux system was working correctly before you needed it on Halloween? Professor Quirrell looked disgusted. You ridiculous. I didn't want to die, Mr. Potter, and that was the only way to test my great creation. What good would it have done to risk my life sooner rather than later? How would I have been better off? Harry swallowed a lump in his throat. There was way for you to test your Horcrux S system without dying. The general lesson is important. Do you see it now? No, Professor Quirrell said after a while. The defense professor gently crumbled one of the last bellflowers together with a strand of long blonde hair and then dropped it into the potion, which was bubbling brighter now. Only 2 more bellflowers remained on the potion's table, and I do hope your lesson is a sensible one for your sake. Suppose, Professor, that I learned how to cast the improved Horcrux spell and I was willing to use it. What would I do with it? Professor Quirrell answered at once. You would find some person whom you found morally abhorrent and whose death you could convince yourself would save other lives and murder them to create a Horcrux. And then what? Make more Horcruxes, said the defense professor. He picked up a jar of what looked like dragon scales. Before that, Harry said. After a time, the defense professor shook his head. I still do not see it, and you will cease this game and tell me. I would make Horcruxes for my friends. If you'd ever really cared about one single other person in the entire world, if there'd been just one person who gave your immortality meaning, someone that you wanted to live forever with you, Harry's throat choked. Then the idea of making a Horcrux for someone else wouldn't have been such a counterintuitive thought. Harry was blinking hard. You have a blind spot around strategies that involve doing nice things for other people, to the point where it stops you from achieving your selfish values. You think it's not your style, I suppose, that particular part of your self-image is what cost you those 9 years. The dropper of mint oil that the defense professor was holding added liquid to the cauldron, drip by drip. I see, the defense professor said slowly. I see. I should have taught Rabastan the advanced Horcrux ritual and forced him to test the invention. Yes, that is supremely obvious in retrospect. For that matter, I could have ordered Rabastan to try mocking himself onto some disposable infant to see what happened before I took myself to Godric's Hollow to create you. Professor Quirrell shook his head bemusedly. Well, I am glad I am realizing this now, and not 10 years earlier. I had enough to chide myself for at that time. You don't see nice ways to do the things you want to do, Harry said. His ears heard a note of desperation in his own voice. Even when a nice strategy would be more effective, you don't see it because you have a self-image of not being nice. That is a fair observation, said Professor Quirrell. Indeed, now that you have pointed it out, I have just now thought of some nice things I can do this very day to further my agenda. Harry just looked at him. Professor Quirrell was smiling. Your lesson is a good one, Mr. Potter. From now on, until I learn the trick of it, I shall keep diligent watch for cunning strategies that involve doing kindnesses for other people. Go and practice acts of goodwill, perhaps, until my mind goes there easily. Cold chills ran down Harry's spine. Professor Quirrell had said this without the slightest visible hesitation. Lord Voldemort was absolutely certain that he could never be redeemed. He wasn't the tiniest bit afraid of it happening to him. The second-to-last bellflower was dropped into the potion, gently. "Any other valuable lessons you would like to teach to Lord Voldemort, boy?" said Professor Quirrell. He was looking up from the potion and grinning as though he knew exactly what Harry was thinking. "Yes," Harry said, his voice almost breaking. "If your goal is to obtain happiness, then doing nice things for other people feels better than doing them for yourself. Do you really think I never thought of that, boy?" The smile had vanished. "Do you think I am stupid? After graduating Hogwarts, I wandered the world for years before I returned to Britain as Lord Voldemort. I have put on more faces than I bothered counting. Do you think I never tried to play the hero just to see how it would feel? Have you come across the name of Alexander Chernyshov? Under that guise, I sought out a forlorn hellhole ruled over by a dark wizard, and I freed the wretched inhabitants from their bondage. They wept tears of gratitude for me. It did not feel like anything in particular. I even stayed about and killed the next 5 dark wizards to try taking command of the place. I spent my own galleons, well, not my own galleons, but the same principle applies to prettify their little country and introduce a semblance of order. They grovelled all the more, and named 1 in 3 of their infants Alexander. I still felt nothing, so I nodded to myself, wrote it off as a fair try, and went upon my way. "And were you happy as Lord Voldemort then?" Harry's voice had risen, grown wild. Professor Quirrell hesitated, then shrugged. "It appears you already know the answer to that. Then why? Why be Voldemort if it doesn't even make you happy?" Harry's voice broke. "I'm you, I'm based on you, so I know that Professor Quirrell isn't just a mask. I know he's somebody you really could have been. Why not just stay that way? Take your curse off the defense position and just stay here. Use the Philosopher's Stone to take David Monroe's shape, and let the real Quirinus Quirrell go free. If you say you'll stop killing people, I'll swear not to tell anyone who you really are. Just be Professor Quirrell, for always. Your students would appreciate you. My father's students appreciate him." Professor Quirrell was chuckling over the cauldron as he stirred it. "There are perhaps 15,000 wizards living in magical Britain, child. There used to be more. There's a reason they're afraid to speak my name. You forgive me that because you liked my battle magic lessons." "Seconded," said Harry's inner Hufflepuff. "Seriously, what the hell?" Harry kept his head raised, though it was trembling. "It's not my place to forgive anything you've done, but it's better than another war." "Ha," said the defense professor. "If you ever find a time-turner that goes back 40 years and can alter history, be sure to tell Dumbledore that before he rejects Tom Riddle's application for the defense position. But alas, I fear that Professor Riddle would not have found lasting happiness in Hogwarts." "Why not?" "Because I still would have been surrounded by idiots, and I wouldn't have been able to kill them," Professor Quirrell said mildly. "Killing idiots is my great joy in life, and I'll thank you not to speak ill of it until you've tried it for yourself." "There's something that would make you happier than that," Harry said, his voice breaking again. "There has to be." "Why?" said Professor Quirrell. "Is this some scientific law I have not yet encountered? Tell me of it." Harry opened his mouth, but couldn't find any words. There had to be something if he could just find the right thing to say. "And you," said Professor Quirrell, "have no right to speak of happiness either. Happiness is not what you hold precious above all. You decided that in the beginning, all the way back in the beginning of this year, when the Sorting Hat offered you Hufflepuff, which I know about, because I received a similar offer and warning all those years ago, and I refused it just as you did. Beyond this, there is little more to say between Tom Riddles." The defense professor turned back to the cauldron. Before Harry could think of any way to reply, Professor Quirrell dropped in the last bellflower, and a burst of glowing bubbles boiled up from the cauldron. "I believe we are done here," Professor Quirrell said. "If you have further questions, they must wait." Harry shakily rose to his feet. Even as Professor Quirrell took up the cauldron and poured out a ridiculously huge volume of effulgent liquid, more than seemed like it could fit in a dozen cauldrons, onto the purple fire that guarded the doorway. The purple fire winked out. "Now for the mirror," said Professor Quirrell, and he drew forth the cloak of invisibility from his robes and floated it to drop before Harry's shoes. 109. Reflections. Even the greatest artifact can be defeated by a counter-artifact that is lesser, but specialized. That was what the defense professor had told Harry after dropping the true cloak of invisibility to pool in fuliginous folds near Harry's shoes. The mirror of perfect reflection has power over what is reflected within it, and that power is said to be unchallengeable. But since the true cloak of invisibility produces a perfect absence of image, it should evade this principle rather than challenging it. There had followed a series of questions in Parseltongue, establishing that Harry currently did not intend to do anything stupid or try to run away, and further reminders that Professor Quirrell could sense him and had spells to detect the cloak, and was holding hostage hundreds of lives plus Hermione. Then Harry was told to don the cloak, open the door that lay beyond the quenched fires, and advance through the door into the final chamber, as Professor Quirrell stood well back, outside of that door's sight. The last chamber was illuminated in lights of soft gold, and the stone walls were of gentle white and faced with marble. In the center of the room stood a simple and unornamented golden frame, and within the frame was a portal to another gold-illuminated room, beyond whose door which lay another potions chamber. That was what Harry's brain told him. Mirror's transformation of light was so perfect that conscious thought was required to deduce that the room inside the frame was only a reflection, rather than a portal, though it might have been easier to intuit if Harry hadn't been invisible just then. The mirror did not touch the ground. The golden frame had no feet. It didn't look like it was hovering. It looked like it was fixed in place, more solid and more motionless than the walls themselves, like it was nailed to the reference frame of the Earth's motion. "Is the mirror there? Is it moving?" came Professor Quirrell's commanding voice from the potions chamber. "Is there?" Harry hissed back. "Not moving." Again tones of command rang forth. "Walk around to the back of the mirror." From behind, the golden frame appeared solid, showing no reflections, and Harry said so in Parseltongue. "Now take off your cloak," commanded Professor Quirrell's voice, still from within the potions room. "Report to me at once if the mirror moves to face you." Harry took off his cloak. The mirror remained nailed to the reference frame of Earth's motion, and Harry reported this. Shortly after there came a hissing and seething, and a balefire phoenix melted through the marble wall behind Harry, the ambient light in the room taking on a red tinge as it entered. Professor Quirrell followed behind it, walking out of the new-made corridor that had been carved, his black formal shoes unharmed by the red-glowing molten surface beneath. "Well," Professor Quirrell said, "that is one possible trap averted." And now, Professor Quirrell exhaled. "Now we will think of possible strategies for retrieving the stone from the mirror, and you will try them, for I prefer not to let my own image be reflected. I give you fair warning, this is the part that may prove tedious. I take it this isn't a problem you can solve with fiendfire." "Ha!" said Professor Quirrell, and gestured. The balefire phoenix moved forward in a rush of crimson terror, the red light casting writhing shadows on the remaining marble walls. Harry jumped back before he could think. The dreadful dark red blaze rushed past Professor Quirrell, surged into the golden back of the mirror, and disappeared as fast as it touched the gold. Then the fire was gone, and the room was tinged scarlet no more. There was no scratch upon the golden surface, no glow to mark the absorption of heat. The mirror had simply remained in place, untouched. Chills went down Harry's spine. If he'd been playing Dungeons and Dragons, and the dungeon master had reported that result, Harry would have suspected a mental illusion and rolled to disbelieve. Upon the center of the golden back had appeared a sequence of runes in no known alphabet, black absences of light in small lines and curves, arranged in a level horizontal row. The thought occurred to Harry that some minor concealing illusion had been consumed in the fiendfire, a far lesser enchantment that had been added to prevent children from seeing those letters. "How old is this mirror?" Harry said in almost a whisper. "Nobody knows, Mr. Potter." The defense professor reached out his fingers toward the runes, a look of something like reverence on his face, but his fingers did not touch the gold. "But my guess is the same as yours, I think. It is said, in certain legends that may or may not be fabrications, that this mirror reflects itself perfectly, and therefore its existence is absolutely stable. So stable that the mirror was able to survive when every other effect of Atlantis was undone, all its consequences severed from time. You can see why I was amused when you suggested fiendfire. The defense professor let his hand fall. Even in the middle of everything else, Harry felt the awe, if that was true. The golden frame gleamed no brighter than before for all the revelation, but you could imagine it going back and back into a civilization that had been made to never be. What does the mirror do exactly? An excellent question, said Professor Quirrell. The answer is in the runes that are written upon the mirror's golden frame. Read them to me. They're not in any alphabet I recognize. They look like randomly oriented chicken scratches drawn by Tolkien elves. Read them anyway. It's not Dangerous. The runes say, Nautilov Ditalo Parks Tenia Hawk Roy Tu Becafra, Tunwo HSI. Harry stopped, feeling more prickles at his spine. Harry knew what the rune for Nautilov meant. It meant Nautilov. And the next rune said to Ditalo the Nautilov until it reached Parks, then keep the part that was both Tenia and Hawk. That belief felt like knowledge, like he could have answered, yes, with confident authority if somebody asked him whether the Tunwo was Roy or Becafra. It was just that when Harry tried to relate those concepts to any other concepts, he drew a blank. Do you understand what words mean, boy? Don't think SSO. Professor Quirrell gave a soft exhalation, his eyes not leaving the golden frame. I had wondered if perhaps the words of false comprehension might be understandable to a student of Muggle science. Apparently not. Maybe, Harry began. Really, Ravenclaw, said Slytherin. You're pulling this now. Maybe I could try again to understand the words if I knew more about the mirror, said Harry's Ravenclaw part, which had assumed direct control. Professor Quirrell's lips quirked up. As with most ancient things, scholars have written down enough lies that it is hard to be sure of anything by now. It is definite that the mirror is at least as old as Merlin, for it is known that Merlin used it as a tool. It is also known that after his death, Merlin left written instructions that the mirror did not need to be sealed away, despite it having certain powers that might normally cause one to worry. He wrote that, given how painstakingly the mirror had been crafted to not destroy the world, it would be easier to destroy the world using a lump of cheese. This statement struck Harry as not entirely reassuring. Certain other facts about the mirror are attested by famous wizards who were reasonably skeptical, and whose word has otherwise proven reliable. The mirror's most characteristic power is to create alternate realms of existence, though these realms are only as large in size as what can be seen within the mirror. It is known that people and other objects can be stored therein. It is claimed by several authorities that the mirror alone of all magics possesses a true moral orientation, though I am not sure what that could mean in practical terms. I would expect moralists to call the Cruciatus Curse by their name of evil and the Patronus Charm by their name of good. I cannot guess what a moralist would think was any more moral than that. But it is claimed, for example, that phoenixes came into our world from a realm that was evoked inside this mirror. Words like jeepers and what his parents would have termed inappropriate language were all running through Harry's head, none very coherently, as he stared at the golden back of the mirror. I have wandered the world and encountered many stories that are not often heard, said Professor Quirrell. Most of them seem to me to be lies, but a few had the ring of history rather than storytelling. Upon a wall of metal in a place where no one had come for centuries, I found written the claim that some Atlanteans foresaw their world's end and sought to forge a device of great power to avert the inevitable catastrophe. If that device had been completed, the story claimed, it would have become an absolutely stable existence that could withstand the channeling of unlimited magic in order to grant wishes. And also, this was said to be the vastly harder task. The device would somehow avert the inevitable catastrophes any sane person would expect to follow from that premise. The aspect I found interesting was that, according to the tale writ upon those metal plates, the rest of Atlantis ignored this project and went upon their ways. It was sometimes praised as a noble public endeavor, but nearly all other Atlanteans found more important things to do on any given day than help. Even the Atlantean nobles ignored the prospect of somebody other than themselves obtaining unchallengeable power, which a less experienced cynic might expect to catch their attention. With relatively little support, the tiny handful of would-be makers of this device labored under working conditions that were not so much dramatically arduous as pointlessly annoying. Eventually, time ran out, and Atlantis was destroyed with the device still far from complete. I recognize certain echoes of my own experience that one does not usually see invented in mere tales. A twist in the dry smile. But perhaps that is merely my own preference for one tale among 100 other legends. You perceive, however, the echo of Merlin's statement about the mirror's creators shaping it to not destroy the world. Most importantly for our purposes, it may explain why the mirror would have the previously unknown capability that Dumbledore or Perenelle seems to have evoked, of showing any person who steps before it an illusion of a world in which one of their desires has been fulfilled. It is the sort of sensible precaution you can imagine someone building into a wish-granting creation meant to not go horribly wrong. "Wow," Harry whispered, and meant it. This was magic with a capital M, the sort of magic that appeared in So You Want to Be a Wizard, not just a collection of random physics-violating things you could do with a wand. Professor Quirrell gestured at the golden back. The final property upon which most tales agree is that whatever the unknown means of commanding the mirror, of that key, there are no plausible accounts. The mirror's instructions cannot be shaped to react to individual people. So it is not possible for Perenelle to command this mirror. Only give the stone to Perenelle. Dumbledore cannot state. Only give the stone to one who wishes to give it to Nicholas Flamel. There is in the mirror a blindness such as philosophers have attributed to ideal justice. It must treat all who come before it by the same rule, whatever rule may be in force. Thus, there must be some rule for reaching the stone's hiding place, which anyone can invoke. And now you see why you, called the boy who lived, shall implement whatever strategies the two of us devise. For it was said that this thing possesses a moral orientation, and it may have been given commands reflecting the same. I am well aware that on conventional terms you are said to be good, just as I am said to be evil. Professor Quirrell smiled, rather darkly. So as our first attempt, though not our last, rest assured let us see what this mirror makes of your attempt to retrieve the stone in order to save the life of Hermione Granger and hundreds of your fellow students. And the first version of that plan, said Harry, who was beginning to finally understand, the one you invented on Friday in my first week of Hogwarts, called for the stone to be retrieved by Dumbledore's golden child, the boy who lived, making a selfless and noble attempt to save the life of his dying defense teacher, Professor Quirrell. Of course, said Professor Quirrell. It was a poetical sort of plot, Harry supposed, but his appreciation of that elegance was being hampered by the surrounding circumstances. Then another thought occurred to Harry. Harry said, you think that this mirror is a trap for you. There is no way beneath the heavens that it is not meant as a trap. That is to say, it's a trap for Lord Voldemort. Only it can't be a trap for him personally. There has to be a general rule that underlies it, some generalizable quality of Lord Voldemort that triggers it. Without conscious awareness, Harry was frowning hard at the mirror's golden back. As you say, said Professor Quirrell, who was beginning to frown at Harry's frowning. Well, on the first Thursday of this year, the mad headmaster Dumbledore, who I'd just seen incinerate a chicken, told me that I had no chance whatsoever of getting into his forbidden corridor, since I didn't know the spell Alohomora. I see, said Professor Quirrell. Oh dear, I wish you had thought to mention this to me a good deal earlier. Neither of them needed to state aloud the obvious, that this bit of reverse psychology had successfully ensured that Harry would stay the heck away from Dumbledore's forbidden corridor. Harry was still concentrating. Do you think Dumbledore suspects that I am, in his terms, a Horcrux of Lord Voldemort, or more generally, that some aspects of my personality were copied off Lord Voldemort? Even as Harry asked this aloud, he realized what a dumb question it was, and how much completely blatant evidence he'd already seen that Dumbledore cannot possibly have missed it, said Professor Quirrell. It is not exactly subtle. What else is Dumbledore to think that you are an actor in a play whose stupid author has never met a real 11-year-old? Only a gibbering dullard would believe that. Never mind. The two of them stared at the mirror in silence. Finally, Professor Quirrell sighed. I have outwitted myself, I fear. Neither you nor I dare be reflected in this mirror. I suppose I must command Professor Sprout to undo my obliviations of Mr. Knott and Miss Greengrass. You see, the other great difficulty of the mirror is that the rule by which it treats those reflected will disregard external forces, such as false memories or a confundus charm. The mirror reflects only those forces arising from within the person themselves, the states of mind they arrive at through their own choices, so it is said in several places. That is why I had Mr. Knott and Miss Greengrass believing different stories about why the stone's extraction was necessary, ready to appear before this mirror. Professor Quirrell rubbed at the bridge of his nose. I constructed other stories for other students, ready for me to set into motion with the chosen trigger. But as this day approached, I began to feel pessimistic about the project. Such as Knott and Greengrass still seem worth trying if we cannot think of something better. But I wonder if Dumbledore has tried to construct this puzzle to specifically resist Voldemort's cunning. I wonder if he might have succeeded. If you devise an alternative plan which I approve enough to try, I promise that whatever pawn I send forth shall not be harmed by me, then or ever. Nor do I expect to break that promise. And I remind you again of the hostages I hold to my failure, both Miss Granger and all the others. Again, they stared at the mirror in silence, the elder Tom Riddle and the younger. I suspect, Professor, Harry said after a time, that your entire class of hypotheses about somebody needing to want the stone for good or honest purposes is mistaken. The headmaster wouldn't set a retrieval rule like that. Why? Because Dumbledore knows how easy it is to end up believing that you're doing the right thing when you're actually not. It'd be the first possibility he imagined. Is it truth or trickery that I hear? "I'm being honest," Harry said. Professor Quirrell nodded. "Then your point is well taken. I'm not sure why you think this puzzle is solvable," Harry said. "Just set a rule like, your left hand must hold a small blue pyramid and two large red pyramids, and your right hand must be squeezing mayonnaise onto a hamster." "No," Professor Quirrell said. "No, I think not. The legends are unclear on what rules can be given, but I think it must have something to do with the mirror's original intended use. It must have something to do with the deep desires and wishes arising from within the person. Squeezing mayonnaise onto a hamster will not qualify as that, for most people." "Ha," Harry said. "Maybe the rule is that the person has to not want to use the stone at all. No, that's too easy. The story you gave Mr. Knott solves it." "In some ways you may understand Dumbledore better than I," said Professor Quirrell. "So now I ask you this. How would Dumbledore use his notion of the acceptance of death to guard this stone? For that above all he thinks I cannot comprehend, and he is not far wrong." Harry thought about this for a while, considering several ideas and discarding them. And then, having thought of something, Harry considered remaining silent. Before mapping out the obvious part of the future conversation, where Professor Quirrell asked him to say in Parseltongue if he'd thought of something, reluctantly Harry spoke. Would Dumbledore think that this mirror could reach the afterlife? Could he put the stone into something that he thinks is an afterlife, so that only people who believe in an afterlife can see it? Professor Quirrell said. "Possibly. Yes, there is a certain plausibility to it. Using this setting of the mirror to show people their heart's desires, Albus Dumbledore would see himself reunited with his family. He would see himself united with them in death, wanting to die himself rather than wishing for them to be returned to life. His brother Aberforth, his sister Ariana, his parents Kendra and Percival. It would be Aberforth to whom Dumbledore gave the stone, I think. Would the mirror recognize that Aberforth particularly had been given the stone? Or will any person's dead relative do, if that person believes their relative's spirit would give them back the stone? Professor Quirrell was pacing in a short circle, keeping well away from Harry and the mirror as he moved. But all this is only one idea. Let us devise another. Harry began to tap his cheek, then stopped abruptly as he realized where he'd picked up that gesture. What if Perenelle is the one who put the stone in here? Maybe she keyed the mirror to give the stone only to the person who put it in originally. "Perenelle has lived this long by knowing her limitations," said Professor Quirrell. "She does not overestimate her own intellect. She is not prideful. If that were so, she would have lost the stone long ago. Perenelle will not try to think of a good mirror rule herself, not when Master Flamel can leave the matter in Dumbledore's wiser hands." But the rule of only returning the stone to the one who remembers placing it also works if Dumbledore himself has placed the stone. It would be a hard rule to bypass, since I cannot simply confund someone into believing that they put in the stone. I would have to create a false stone and a false mirror and arrange the drama. Professor Quirrell was frowning now, but it is still something that Dumbledore would imagine Voldemort being able to arrange, given time. If at all possible, Dumbledore will want to make the key to the mirror a state of mind he thinks I cannot arrange in a pawn, or a rule that Dumbledore thinks Voldemort can never comprehend, such as a rule involving the acceptance of one's own death. That is why I considered your previous idea plausible. Then Harry had an idea. He was not sure if it was a good idea. It wasn't like Harry had a lot of choice here. Argendo, Harry said. We're not sure what's necessary to retrieve the stone. A sufficient condition should involve Albus Dumbledore, or maybe someone else, in a state of mind where they believe that the Dark Lord has been defeated, that the threat is over, and that it is time to take out the stone and give it back to Nicholas Flamel. We aren't sure which part of that person's state of mind, let's say Dumbledore's, will be the necessary part that he thinks Lord Voldemort can't understand or duplicate. But under those conditions, Dumbledore's entire state of mind will be sufficient. Reasonable, said Professor Quirrell. So, the corresponding strategy, Harry said carefully, is to mimic Dumbledore's state of mind under those conditions in as much detail as possible while standing in front of the mirror. And this state of mind must have been produced by internal forces, not external ones. But how are we to get that without legilimency or the confundus charm, both of which would certainly be external? Ha! I see. Professor Quirrell's ice-pale eyes were suddenly piercing. You suggest that I confund myself, as you cast that hex upon yourself during your first day in battle magic, so that it is an internal force and not an external one, a state of mind that comes about through only my own choices. Say to me whether you have made this suggestion with the intention of trapping me, boy. Say it to me in Parseltongue. My mind that you ask to devise S strategy may perhaps have been influenced by S such an intent, who knows. Knew you would be S suspicious. Ask this S very question. Decision is up to you, teacher. I know nothing you do not know about whether this S is likely to trap you. Do not call it betrayal by me if you choose this S for yourself, and it fails. Harry felt a strong impulse to smile, and suppressed it. Lovely, said Professor Quirrell, who was smiling. I suppose there are some threats from an inventive mind that even questioning in Parseltongue cannot neutralize. Harry put on the cloak of invisibility at Professor Quirrell's orders to stop the man who shall believe himself to be schoolmaster from seeing you, as Professor Quirrell said in Parseltongue. Wearing the cloak or no, you will stand in range of the mirror yourself, Professor Quirrell said. If a gush of lava comes forth, you will also burn. I feel that much symmetry should apply. Professor Quirrell pointed to a spot near the right of the door through which they'd entered the room, before the mirror and well back of it. Harry, wearing the cloak, went to where Professor Quirrell had pointed him, and did not argue. It was increasingly unclear to Harry whether both Riddles dying here would be a bad thing, even with hundreds of other student hostages at stake. For all of Harry's good intentions, he'd mostly shown himself so far to be an idiot, and the returned Lord Voldemort was a threat to the entire world. Though either way, Harry couldn't see Dumbledore doing the lava thing. Dumbledore was probably sufficiently angry at Voldemort to discard his usual restraint, but lava wouldn't permanently stop an entity that Dumbledore believed to be a discorporate soul. Then Professor Quirrell pointed with his wand, and a shimmering circle appeared around where Harry was standing on the floor. This, Professor Quirrell said, would soon become a greater circle of concealment, by which nothing within that circle could be heard or seen from the outside. Harry would not be able to make himself apparent to the false Dumbledore by taking off the cloak, nor by shouting. You will not cross this circle once it is active, Professor Quirrell said. That would cause you to touch my magic, and while confunded I might not remember how to halt the resonance that would destroy us both. And further, since I do not want you throwing shoes, Professor Quirrell made another gesture, and just within the greater circle of concealment, a slight shimmer appeared in the air, a globe-shaped distortion. This barrier will explode if touched by you or other material thing. The resonance might lash at me afterward, but you would also be dead. Now tell me in parcel tongue that you do not intend to cross this circle, or take off your cloak, or do anything at all impulsive or stupid. Tell me you will wait quietly here, under the cloak, until this is over." This Harry repeated back. Then Professor Quirrell's robes became black tinged with gold, such robes as Dumbledore might wear upon a formal occasion, and Professor Quirrell pointed his own wand at his head. Professor Quirrell stayed motionless for a long time, still holding his wand to his head. His eyes were closed in concentration, and then Professor Quirrell said, "Confundus." At once the expression of the man standing there changed. He blinked a few times as though confused, lowering his wand. A deep weariness spread over the face Professor Quirrell had worn. Without any visible change, his eyes seemed older, the few lines in his face calling attention to themselves. His lips were set in a sad smile. Without any hurry, the man quietly walked over to the mirror, as though he had all the time in the world. He crossed into the mirror's range of reflection without anything happening and stared into the surface. What the man might be seeing there, Harry could not tell. To Harry it seemed that the flat, perfect surface still reflected the room behind it, like a portal to another place. "Ariana," breathed the man. "Mother, father, and you, my brother, it is done." The man stood still, as if listening. "Yes, done," the man said. "Voldemort came before this mirror and was trapped by Merlin's method. He's only one more sealed horror now." Again the listening stillness. "I would that I could obey you, my brother, but it is better this way." The man bowed his head. "He is denied his death forever. That vengeance is terrible enough." Harry felt a twinge watching this, a sense that this was not what Dumbledore would have said. It seemed more like a strawman, a shallow stereotype. But then this wasn't the real Aberforth's spirit either. This was who Professor Quirrell imagined Dumbledore imagined Aberforth was, and that doubly reflected image of Aberforth wouldn't notice anything amiss. "It is time to give back the Philosopher's Stone," said the man who thought he was Dumbledore. "It must go back into Master Flamel's keeping now." Listening stillness. "No," said the man. "Master Flamel has kept it safe these many years from all who would seek immortality, and I think it will be safest in his hands. No, Aberforth, I do think his intentions are good." Harry couldn't control the tension that was running through him like a live wire. He was having trouble breathing. Imperfect, Professor Quirrell's Confundus charm had been imperfect. The underlying personality of Professor Quirrell was leaking through and seeing the obvious question. Why it was okay for Nicholas Flamel himself to have the stone if immortality was so awful. Even if Professor Quirrell conceptualized Dumbledore as being blind to the question, Professor Quirrell hadn't included a clause in the Confundus saying that Dumbledore's image of Aberforth wouldn't think of it. And all of this was ultimately a reflection of Professor Quirrell's own mind, an image from within the intelligence of Tom Riddle. "Destroy it," said the man. "Maybe. I am not sure it can be destroyed, or Master Flamel would have done it long since. I think, many times, that he has regretted making it. Aberforth, I promised him, and we are not so ancient or so wise ourselves. The Philosopher's Stone must go back into the keeping of the one who made it." And Harry's breath stopped. The man was holding an irregular chunk of scarlet glass in his left hand, the size perhaps of Harry's thumb from fingernail to the first joint. The sheen surface of the scarlet glass made it seem wet. The appearance was of blood, suspended in time and made into a jagged surface. "Thank you, my brother," the man said quietly. "Is that what the stone should look like? Does Professor Quirrell know what the true stone should look like? Will the mirror give back the real stone under these conditions, or make an imitation and return that?" And then, "No, Ariana," the man said, smiling gently. "I fear I must go now." "Be patient, my dearest. It will be soon enough that I join you in truth." Why, I am not sure why I must go. When I hold the stone I am to step aside from the mirror and wait for Master Flamel to contact me, but I am not sure why I need to step aside from the mirror to do that." The man sighed. "Ah, I am getting old. It is well this dreadful war ended when it did. I suppose there is no harm if I speak to you for a time, my dearest, if you wish it so." A headache was starting behind Harry's eyes. Some part of Harry was trying to send a message about not having breathed in a while, but no one was listening. Imperfect, Professor Quirrell's Confundus charm had been imperfect. Professor Quirrell's image of Dumbledore's image of Ariana wanted to talk to Dumbledore, and maybe didn't want to wait, because Professor Quirrell knew on some level that there wasn't really an afterlife, and the previously implanted impulse to leave after getting the stone wasn't standing up to Riddle Ariana's arguments. And then Harry felt himself become very calm. He started breathing again. Either way, there wasn't much Harry could do about it. Professor Quirrell had stopped Harry from intervening. Well, Professor Quirrell was welcome to reap the consequences of that decision. If the consequences caught Harry as well, so be it. The man who thought he was Dumbledore was mostly nodding patiently, sometimes replying to his dearest sister. Sometimes the man cast an uneasy look to one side, as if feeling a strong impulse to go, but suppressing that impulse with the great patience and politeness and concern for his sister that Professor Quirrell imagined Albus Dumbledore having. Harry saw it the instant the confundus wore off, and the man's expression changed, becoming again the face of Professor Quirrell. And in the same instant the mirror changed, no longer showing Harry the reflection of the room, showing instead the form of the real Albus Dumbledore, as though he were standing just behind the mirror and visible through it. The real Dumbledore's face was set and grim. "Hello, Tom," said Albus Dumbledore. Ch. 110 will post on February 24th, 2015 at 12 p.m. Pacific/8 p.m. UTC. 110. Reflections PT2. The grimness on Albus Dumbledore's face lasted only an instant before giving way to bewilderment. Queeriness. What? And then there was a pause. "Well," said Albus Dumbledore, "I do feel stupid." "I should hope so," Professor Quirrell said easily. If he had been at all shocked himself at being caught, it did not show. A casual wave of his hand changed his robes back to a professor's clothing. Dumbledore's grimness had returned and redoubled. "I am searching so hard for Voldemort's shade, never noticing that the defense professor of Hogwarts is a sickly, half-dead victim possessed by a spirit far more powerful than himself. I would call it senility if so many others had not missed it as well." "Quite," said Professor Quirrell. He lifted his eyebrows. "Really, am I that hard to recognize without the glowing red eyes?" "Oh, yes, indeed," Albus Dumbledore said in level tones. "Your acting was perfect. I confess myself utterly deceived." Quirinus Quirrell seemed, what is the term I am looking for? Ah, yes, that is the word. He seemed sane. Professor Quirrell chuckled. He looked for all the world as though the two of them were just having a casual conversation. "I never was insane, you know. Lord Voldemort was just another game for me, the same as Professor Quirrell." Albus Dumbledore did not look like he was enjoying a casual chat. "I thought you might say that." "I regret to inform you, Tom, that anyone who can bring himself to act the part of Voldemort is Voldemort." "Ah," said Professor Quirrell, raising an admonishing finger. "There is a loophole in that reasoning, old man. Anyone who acts the part of Voldemort must be what moralists call evil. On this we agree. But perhaps the real me is completely, utterly, irredeemably evil in an interestingly different fashion from what I was pretending with Voldemort. I find," Albus Dumbledore ground out, "that I do not care." "Then you must think yourself to be rid of me very soon," said Professor Quirrell. "How interesting. My immortal existence must depend on discovering what trap you have set and finding a way to escape from it as soon as possible." Professor Quirrell paused. "But let us pointlessly delay to talk of other matters first. How did you come to be waiting inside the mirror? I thought you would be elsewhere." "I am there," Albus Dumbledore said, "and also inside the mirror, unfortunately for you. I have always been here all along." "Ah," said Professor Quirrell and sighed. "I suppose my little distraction was for naught then." And the rage of Albus Dumbledore was no longer leashed. "Distraction," roared Dumbledore, his sapphire eyes tight with fury. "You killed Master Flamel for a distraction." Professor Quirrell looked dismayed. "I am wounded by the injustice of your accusation. I did not kill the one you know as Flamel. I simply commanded another to do so." "How could you? Even you, how could you? He was the library of all our lore, secrets you have forever lost to wizardry." There was an edge to Professor Quirrell's smile now. "You know, I still do not comprehend how your twisted mind can consider it acceptable for Flamel to be immortal, but when I try for the same it makes me a monster. Master Flamel never descended into immortality. He Dumbledore choked. He only stayed awake past his evening, for our sakes, through his long, long day. I don't know if you recall this," Professor Quirrell said, his voice airy. "But do you recall that day in your office with Tom Riddle? The one where I begged you, where I went down on my knees and begged you to introduce me to Nicholas Flamel so that I could ask to become his apprentice, to someday make for myself the Philosopher's Stone. That was my last attempt to be a good person, if you are curious. You told me no, and gave me a lecture on how unvirtuous it was to be afraid of death. I went from your office in bitterness and in fury. I reasoned that if I was to be called evil in any case, just for not wanting to die, then I might as well be evil. And 1 month later I killed Abigail Myrtle to pursue immortality by other means. Even when I knew more of Flamel, I remained quite put out with your hypocrisy. And for that reason, I tormented you and yours more than I otherwise would have done. I have often felt that you ought to know this, but we never had a chance to talk frankly." "I decline," said Albus Dumbledore, whose gaze did not waver. "I do not accept the tiniest shred of responsibility for what you have become. That was all entirely you and your own decisions." "I am not surprised to hear you say that," said Professor Quirrell. "Well, now I am curious as to what responsibilities you do accept. You have access to some unusual power of divination. That much I deduced long ago. You made too many nonsensical moves, and the paths by which they worked out in your favor were too ridiculous. So tell me, were you forewarned of the result that night of All Hallows' Eve when I was vanquished for a time?" "I knew," said Albus Dumbledore, his voice low and cold. "For that, I accept responsibility, which is something you will never understand. You arranged for Severus Snape to hear the prophecy that he brought to me." "I allowed it to happen," said Albus Dumbledore. "And there I was, all excited at having finally gained my own foreknowledge." Professor Quirrell shook his head as though in sadness. "So the great hero Dumbledore sacrificed his unwitting pawns, Lily and James Potter, merely to banish me for a few years." Albus Dumbledore's eyes were like stones. "James and Lily would have gone willingly to the death if they had known. And the little baby," Professor Quirrell said. "Somehow I doubt the Potters would have been so eager to leave him in the path of you-know-who." You could scarcely see the flinch. "The boy who lived came out of it well enough. Tried to turn him into you, did you? Instead, you turned yourself into a corpse, and Harry Potter became the wizard you should have been." Now there was something like the usual Dumbledore behind the half-moon glasses, a tiny twinkle in those eyes. All of Tom Riddle's icy brilliance tamed to the service of James and Lily's warmth and love. "I wonder how you felt when you saw what Tom Riddle could have become if he had grown up in a loving family." Professor Quirrell's lips quirked. "I was surprised, even shocked, by the abyssal depths of Mr. Potter's naivete. I suppose the humor of the situation would be lost on you. It was then, finally, that Albus Dumbledore smiled. How I laughed when I realized it. When I saw you had made a good Voldemort to oppose the evil one, how I laughed. I never had the steel for my role, but Harry Potter shall be more than equal to it when he comes into his power." Albus Dumbledore's smile disappeared. "Though I suppose Harry shall have to find some other Dark Lord to vanquish for it, since you will not be there." "Ah, yes, that." Professor Quirrell made to walk away from the mirror and seemed to halt just before reaching the point where the mirror would no longer have reflected him if it had been reflecting him. "Interesting." Dumbledore's smile was colder now. "No, Tom, you're not going anywhere." Professor Quirrell nodded. "What have you done, exactly?" "You have refused death," said Dumbledore, "and if I destroyed your body, your spirit would only wander back, like a dumb animal that cannot understand it is being sent away. So I am sending you outside time, to a frozen instant from which neither I nor any other can return you. Perhaps Harry Potter will be able to retrieve you someday, if prophecy speaks true. He may wish to discuss with you just who is at fault for the deaths of his parents. For you it will only be an instant, if you ever return at all. Either way, Tom, I wish you the best of it." "Ahem," said Professor Quirrell. The defense professor had paced past where Harry stood, watching mute, and with something like horror, only to halt again at the other edge of the mirror. "As I suspected. You are using Merlin's old method of sealing, what the tale of Tofirius Chang names as the process of the timeless. If legend speaks true, not even you can stop the process, now that it has been in motion this long." "Indeed," said Albus Dumbledore, but his eyes were suddenly wary, and Harry, from where he stood just before and to the right of the door, waiting in silence and controlled terror, could feel it in the air. He could feel the sense of a presence gathering within the mirror's field. Something more alien than magic, everything about it incomprehensible except for the fact of its strangeness and the fact of its power. It had been slow, but now it was waxing faster, that presence. But you could still reverse the effect, if Chang's account is true, said Professor Quirrell. Most powers of the mirror are double-sided, according to legend, so you could banish what is on the other side of the mirror instead. Send yourself, instead of me, into that frozen instant. If you wanted to, that is. And why would I do that? Albus Dumbledore's voice was tight. I suppose you're going to tell me that you have taken hostages. That was futile, Tom, you fool, you utter fool. You should have known that I would give you nothing for any hostages you had taken. You always were one step too slow, said Professor Quirrell. Allow me to introduce you to my hostage. Another presence invaded the air around Harry, a crawling sensation all over his flesh, as another Tom Riddle's magic passed very close to his skin. The cloak of invisibility was torn away from him, and the shimmering black cloak flew away from him, through the air. Professor Quirrell caught it and swiftly drew it over himself. In less than a second, he had pulled down the cloak's hood over his head and disappeared. Albus Dumbledore staggered, as though some essential support had been removed from him. Harry Potter, the headmaster breathed. What are you doing here? Harry stared at the image of Albus Dumbledore, on whose face utter shock and utter dismay were warring. The guilt and the shame were too much, hitting Harry all at once, and he could feel the incomprehensible presence around him rising to a peak. Harry knew without words that there was no time left, and that he was done. It's my fault, Harry said in a tiny voice, from whatever part of him had taken over his throat in the final extremity. I was stupid. I've always been stupid. You mustn't rescue me. Goodbye. Why, look at that, sang out Professor Quirrell's voice from the empty air. I don't seem to have a reflection anymore. No, said Albus Dumbledore. No, no, no. Into the hand of the Albus Dumbledore flew from his sleeve his long, dark grey wand, and in his other hand, as though from nowhere, appeared a short rod of dark stone. Albus Dumbledore threw these both violently aside, just as the building sense of power rose to an unbearable peak, and then disappeared. The mirror returned to showing the ordinary reflection of a gold-lit room of white stone, without any trace of where Albus Dumbledore had been. The next update will be on February 25th, 2015 at 10:30 a.m. Pacific 6:30 p.m. UTC. This will be followed by another update on the same day at 1 p.m. Pacific/9:00 p.m. UTC. I have some intercity traveling to do tomorrow, involving a train, hence the weird schedule. Please do not panic if either update is late. 111. Failure, PT1. The Dark Lord was laughing. From the empty air came the voice of the defense professor laughing wildly, so high and terrible his laughter. It was Voldemort's laughter now, the Dark Lord's laughter beyond all hiding or restraint. Harry's mind was disarrayed. His eyes kept staring at where Albus Dumbledore had been. There was a horror in him that was too huge for understanding or reflection. His mind kept trying to fall back through time and undo reality, but that wasn't a sort of magic that existed, and reality stayed the same. He had lost. He had lost Dumbledore. There were no take-backs, and that meant he had lost the war. And the Dark Lord went on laughing. Ah, aha, aha, ha, ha. Professor Dumbledore, ah, Professor Dumbledore, such a fitting end to our game. Another burst of wild laughter. The wrong sacrifice even at the finish, for the piece you gave up everything to save was already in my possession. The wrong trap even from the beginning, for I could have abandoned this body at any time. Ah, ha 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 ha, aha, you never did learn cunning, you poor old fool. You, a voice was coming from Harry's throat. You, ah ha ha ha. Why, yes, little child, you were always along on this adventure as my hostage. It was your whole purpose in being here. Ha 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 ha. You are decades too young to play this game against the real Tom Riddle, child. The Dark Lord drew back the hood of the cloak, his head becoming visible, and began to remove the rest of the cloak. And now, boy, you have helped me, yes, indeed, and so it is time to resurrect your girl-child friend, to keep promise. The Dark Lord's smile was cold, cold indeed. I suppose you have doubts. Mark well, I could kill you this instant, for there is no longer a headmaster of Hogwarts to be informed of it. Doubt me all you wish, but remember that. The hand was once more holding the gun. Now come along, foolish child. And they left. They went back out through the door into the potions room, the Dark Lord banishing the returned purple fire with a stroke of his wand. They went through the chamber where the boggart had been, and the chamber of ruined chess statues, and through the burned door of the chamber of keys. The Dark Lord floated up through the trapdoor, and Harry struggled up afterward through the spiral staircase of leaves, the tendrils of the devil's snare twitching, and then moving back as though afraid. The boy who lived was trying hard not to burst into tears, and his dark side patterns weren't helping, maybe because Voldemort had never known or dealt with guilt. They passed the huge, three-headed inferi, and at a whispered word from the Dark Lord, it collapsed over the trapdoor and became a corpse again. They passed Severus Snape standing guard, who told them both that he was guarding the door and that they must leave or he would deduct house points. The Dark Lord spoke the words, Haekuju Montauk, without pausing in his stride, accompanied by a jab of his wand, and Severus staggered before he lifelessly drew himself up beside the door once more. What? Harry said as he followed. What did you? Just fulfilling my obligation to my faithful servant. It shall not kill him, as I promised you. The Dark Lord laughed again. The hostages, Harry said. It was hard to keep his voice steady. The students, you said you'd stop whatever is going to kill them. Yes, stop worrying. We'll do on our way out. Out. We are leaving, child. The Dark Lord was still smiling. The bad feeling this raised was lost in a sea of other bad feelings. The Dark Lord was now consulting what he'd called the Hogwarts map, the handwritten lines upon it seeming to move as they walked. Some part of Harry's mind that had been considering what to do if they ran into Aurors on patrol, whom the Dark Lord could kill or obliviate in an instant, gave up that hope as well. They went down the grand staircase to the second floor, encountering no one. The Dark Lord made a turn Harry did not know, and went down another stair flight. As they descended past one floor and another, the windows stopped, and the torches began. They were within the Slytherin dungeons now. Ahead, the form of a person in Hogwarts robes appeared. The Dark Lord kept walking toward that person. Harry followed. A 6th or 7th year Slytherin was wading by a section of wall that was set with an artistic carving of Salazar Slytherin wielding his wand, against what looked like a giant covered in icicles. The witch made no comment at seeing Professor Quirrell walking upright, or seeing Harry in his company, or seeing the gun in the defense professor's hand. If her eyes were blank, Harry couldn't tell the difference. The Dark Lord reached into his robes, took out a nut and flipped it to her. Claudia Alictor Tabor, I command you thus. Take this nut to the spell circle I showed you beneath the Quidditch stands and put it in the center. Then obliviate yourself of the last 6 hours. Yes, Lord, the witch said, bowing to him, and went on her way. I thought, Harry said. I thought you needed the stone to. The Dark Lord was still smiling. He had never stopped smiling. I did not say that part in Parseltongue, child. All I said in Parseltongue was that I had set events in motion to kill students, events that I would stop if I obtained the stone. The rest was in human speech. I would also have stopped the blood-fought sacrifice if I had not obtained the stone, so long as I was not discovered and restrained. The students of Hogwarts are a valuable resource, whom I have already spent much time training. Then the Dark Lord hissed to the wall, open. Harry's eyes saw the tiny snake that had been set in the upper left of the carving, even as the wall slowly swung backward, revealing the opening of a huge pipe. Moss grew on its sides, and a musty, dusty smell welled up from it. The interior was also covered with cobwebs in multiple sheets. Spiders, murmured the Dark Lord. He sighed, and for that brief moment he sounded once more like Professor Quirrell. The Dark Lord walked into the huge pipe, the cobwebs burning away before him. Harry, not seeing any other better options, followed. The pipe branched in a Y shape, then branched again. The Dark Lord went left, then right. The pipe came to a solid metal wall. Open, the Dark Lord hissed, and a crack appeared in the metal. It seemed to fold into itself. Beyond was the middle of a long stone tunnel. We shall be walking a while, said the Dark Lord. Did you have more questions to ask, little child? I can't think of any right now. Another cold laugh replied to this, and they walked into the tunnel, turning right. Harry didn't know, then or ever, how long he walked. The light of burning spiderwebs was too dim to read his mechanical watch, and Harry had not thought to look at the time before entering. It felt like they walked for miles, miles beneath the ground. Slowly, Harry's mind tried to recover itself a final time. Very possibly final, if he was right about the Dark Lord killing him after this. Though the Dark Lord had said that he would resurrect Hermione, which seemed pointless if that was true. Was that simply the Dark Lord following through on a promise he would not otherwise have been able to make in Parseltongue? Why had he not just shot Harry on the spot? Seriously, some last functioning part of his brain said to all the other parts, this would be a good time to think of something. Something that the Dark Lord has not already thought of. Something we can do without our pouch, or our wand, or our time-turner. Something that Professor Quirrell has not imagined we can do. Think. Pretty please think of something. Don't shut down now, even if you're scared, even if we've never really faced death before in the sense of being about to die in the next hour. This is not the time to shut down. Harry's mind stayed blank. Suppose, said that last remaining part, suppose we try to condition on the fact that we win this, or at least get out of this alive. If someone told you as a fact that you had survived, or even won, somehow made everything turn out okay, what would you think had happened? Not legitimate procedure, whispered Ravenclaw. The universe doesn't work like that. We're just going to die. Someone realizes we're missing, thought Hufflepuff, and Mad-Eye Moody shows up with a squad of auras and rescues us. I think the time has come to admit we're not more competent than the standard authorities. The saving factor does have to be something we do somehow, said the last voice. Otherwise, there's no point in our thinking about it. Problem 2, said Gryffindor. Harry Potter isn't missing. He's right there at the Quidditch match where everyone can see him. Professor Quirrell thought of that too. It's part of why he sent that fake note. Problem 3. I don't think Mad-Eye Moody and an Aura Squad can beat the Dark Lord, and certainly not before he kills us. I'm not sure the entire DMLE can beat the Dark Lord if he's fighting seriously, and Dumbledore is gone. Problem 4. The Quidditch match was not disrupted. That's probably the only reason why Professor Quirrell was willing to try something as complicated as bringing us along on this trip in the first place. Thinking along different lines, ventured Slytherin, maybe Professor Quirrell calls in someone else to memory charm us. Legilimency, Imperius, Confundus, who knows what else, we're not a perfect Occlumens. Then the Dark Lord would have a smart, sort of smart lieutenant that he could use. That could be another reason why Professor Quirrell was so willing to tell us secrets if he knew that the memory would disappear. It's also a reason to leave the Hogwarts wards, so the Dark Lord can call Bellatrix to apparate in and do the work. This entire reasoning process is illegitimate, and I refuse to participate, said Ravenclaw. What lovely last words, said the last voice. Now shut up and think. Rough stone tunnel went by underfoot, Harry's shoe sometimes dipping into moisture or nearly slipping on a curved surface. The neurons in his brain, which kept on firing, imagined voices talking to each other, yelling at each other, even as the listener stayed numb with horror and shame. Gryffindor and Hufflepuff were conducting a debate about suicide by charging the Dark Lord's gun, or by swallowing the little jewel on Harry's steel ring. It seemed unclear whether the fate of the world was better or worse if the Dark Lord had Harry as a mind slave. If the Dark Lord was going to win anyway, it might be better if he won faster. And the last voice kept talking through it all. Even in the depths of failure, that last voice remained. What else did the Dark Lord always say in human speech and never in Parseltongue? Do we remember? Anything like that, anything at all. It was all too distant in time even though it had all happened this very day. The Dark Lord had told him in Parseltongue just now that it was time to revive Hermione, and then he'd said other things all in English. Harry could hardly remember for all that they'd just been spoken. Before then, there had been the circle of concealment, when Professor Quirrell had hissed that the barrier would explode if touched, and the defense professor had said in English for Harry not to take off his cloak or try crossing the circle, said in English that the resonance might strike Professor Quirrell afterwards, but Harry would be dead. Said in English that if Harry touched the magic and Professor Quirrell didn't remember how to halt the resonance, it would kill them both. Suppose it doesn't kill us both, said the last voice. On Halloween in Godric's Hollow, the Dark Lord's body was burned, and we only ended up with a scar on our forehead. Suppose the resonance between us is deadlier to the Dark Lord than to us. What if this entire time we've been able to kill the Dark Lord at any time, just by dashing forward and touching our hands to any part of his exposed skin. And then it makes our scar bleed again, but that's all. The sense of stop, don't do that, is inherited from the Dark Lord's worst memory of his mistake in Godric's Hollow. It may not actually apply to the boy who lived. A small note of hope rose and was quashed. The Dark Lord can just throw away his wand, droned Ravenclaw. Professor Quirrell can turn into his animagus form. Even if he dies, the Dark Lord will possess someone else and return, and then torture our parents to punish us. We might be able to get to our parents in time, said the last voice. We might be able to hide them. We might be able to get the Philosopher's Stone away from the Dark Lord if we killed his current body now, and that stone could provide the nucleus of a counter-army. The Dark Lord was moving on through the stony corridor. His hand still held the gun. He was at least 4 meters away from Harry. If we dart forward, he will sense us approaching through the resonance, said Hufflepuff. He will fly forward rapidly. He can do that. He has the broomstick enchantments that let him fly. He will fly forward, turn around, and fire the gun. He knows about the resonance. He's thought of this already. This is not something the Dark Lord has failed to consider. He will be ready for it and waiting. Continuing the same line of argument, said the last voice. Suppose we can freely cast magic on Professor Quirrell, but he can't cast it on us. Why would that be true? Demanded Ravenclaw. In fact, we have evidence that it's false. In Azkaban, when Professor Quirrell's Avada Kedavra hit our Patronus charm, it felt like our head was splitting apart. Suppose that was all his magic going out of control. Suppose if we just cast, say, a Lumino's targeting him, nothing bad would have happened. But why? Said Ravenclaw. Why suppose that? Because, thought Harry, it explains why Professor Quirrell didn't warn me not to cast any magic on him in Azkaban. Because Professor Quirrell never said in Parseltongue that I can remember that I'd hurt myself if I tried to cast magic on him. He could have given me that warning, but he didn't, even though he gave me a lot of other warnings. Absence of evidence is weak evidence of absence. There was a pause while Harry's parts considered this. We don't actually have our wand, said Ravenclaw. We might get it back at some point, thought the last voice. But even then, Harry thought, and the grey hopelessness returned, the resonance is something the Dark Lord knows about. He's already thought of everything I can do with that. He already has a response prepared. That was my mistake from the beginning. I didn't respect the Dark Lord's intelligence. I didn't think that maybe he knew everything I knew and could see everything I saw and had already taken it into account. Then, said the last voice, conditional on our winning, we must have hit him with something he doesn't know about. Dementors, offered Gryffindor. The Dark Lord knows we can destroy, deflect, and possibly control Dementors, said Ravenclaw. He doesn't know how, but he knows we have the capability, and where the heck will we get a Dementor anyway? Maybe, ventured Hufflepuff, the Dark Lord's whole Horcrux system would short out via the resonance if we grabbed him and held him, sacrificing our own life to destroy him forever. Bullhacky, said Ravenclaw. But I guess it doesn't hurt to engage in some pleasant fantasy before we die, no matter how stupid. If Lord Voldemort had a strong enough fear of death, Hufflepuff argued, if he wanted strongly enough to just not need to think about death again, then the Horcrux system could have design flaws like that. It never occurred to Voldemort to test his Horcruxes on someone else. That could indicate he wasn't able to think about the subject clearly. So his fear of death is his fatal weakness, said Ravenclaw. Yeah, no. I'm thinking someone with over 100 Horcruxes might have a few fail-safe mechanisms in there. And Harry's brain went on thinking. A genuine asymmetry in the magical resonance between them seemed improbable. There was no reason for the magical effect to work like that. But the magical backlash could hit the stronger wizard harder, the more powerful magic resonating more dangerously. That could explain the observed event in Godric's Hollow. Voldemort explodes, baby survives, and also explain the observed event in Azkaban. Voldemort severely impaired by backlash of his strong magic, first-year boy, who lived hit by lighter backlash of his weak magic. Or if it was only the caster's magic that resonated, that could also explain both those two observations. That might even explain why Professor Quirrell had been in no rush to warn Harry against casting any magic on him. Though there was another obvious reason why Professor Quirrell would avoid raising the subject of the resonance. It was a gigantic hint about the mystery of Godric's Hollow, if Harry had ever made the connection. The part that was numb with grief and guilt took this opportunity to observe, speaking of obliviousness, that after events at Hogwarts had turned serious, they really should have reconsidered the decision made on first Thursday, at the behest of Professor McGonagall, not to tell Dumbledore about the sense of doom that Harry got around Professor Quirrell. It was true that Harry hadn't been sure who to trust. There was a long stretch where it had seemed plausible that Dumbledore was the bad guy and Professor Quirrell the heroic opposition. But Dumbledore would have realized. Dumbledore would have realized instantly. Wise old wizard with the true phoenix on his shoulder would have known, and Harry hadn't trusted him. Harry hadn't told him all the relevant facts, and the reason for this had been sheer neglect to reconsider a cached decision made 4 days into the start of the school year. It had been mocked, something not to tell Dumbledore. And even after Azkaban, even after Hermione died, even after everything, Harry had simply forgot to promote the question to deliberation and reconsider the trade-off. Another wave of grief and shame washed over Harry, and for a time he walked on in the silence of the last voice, other voices being happy enough to fill the gap. After what was at least several miles, and many grey thoughts, the stone tunnel ended. The Dark Lord climbed up stone steps, and Harry followed after. The two of them came into a dark, dank stone building. Dirty old stone doors swung open without being touched. Before them lay marble slabs, rising up from bare ground, upon them names and dates. The tombstones were scattered in nothing like neat rows, and the rest of the graveyard ran wild. The moon above was over 3/4 full, already seeming bright, with night not fully fallen. Harry had stopped walking upon seeing the graveyard. There was a blaring alarm in his brain saying to be anywhere other than here, but there weren't any options for accomplishing that. So that alarm cried unanswered, even as behind Harry the stone doors of the mausoleum swung shut again and sealed themselves. The Dark Lord came into the center of the scattered graveyard. He stopped walking and waved his wand above his head in a small circle. There was a rumbling sound, and smoothly from the ground rose an altar, at least 2 meters wide and of black stone carved with grey sigils. And then surrounding the altar groaned up 6 dark marble obelisks, regularly spaced, gleaming darkly beneath the fading twilight sky. The unanswerable alarm in Harry's brain grew louder. "This," said the Dark Lord in Professor Quirrell's cadences, "is a workspace I made for myself, convenient to either Hogwarts or Hogsmeade." The Dark Lord flourished a hand at the altar. "That is where Miss Granger shall revive, and also where I shall be reborn into my true body. I shall remake myself first, of course. Magic's to revive girl-child Esia with true body." A strange, snackish laughter accompanied these words. Rest assured that though some aspects of girl-child's resurrection shall be what others consider dark, girl-child will not be harmed or made ugly by it. Shall still look like herself, mind shall be her own, nor shall I or mine harm her after. Harry's tongue was dry, and his mind was having trouble functioning. "Please, Professor, would you say in parcel tongue what is your real purpose in resurrecting Miss Granger? To restore to you girl-child friends' counsel and restraint. To make Eshaw Eshi is part of the world for you to care about. That, boy, is truly the greater part of the reason I am doing this deed." Again, snackish laughter accompanied these words, conveying sardonic awareness of some vast irony. A small spark of hope kindled inside Harry, alongside the much greater note of confusion and the fear that a perfect occlumens could indeed lie in Parseltongue. Harry didn't understand why the Dark Lord was doing this, if the next step was just to kill the boy who lived, or enslave him. Maybe he just never understood Professor Quirrell at all. Maybe somehow Harry's model of Tom Riddle was just that wrong. Maybe the boy who lived would be obliviated of the last day and dropped off somewhere with a confused Hermione Granger, while Lord Voldemort went on to conquer the world. Hope flared up in Harry, but it was a confused hope that didn't make any sense. It didn't square with the Dark Lord who had mocked Dumbledore and laughed at his defeat. Harry couldn't come up with any consistent account of Professor Quirrell's motives that allowed for something like that. I do not know what is meant to happen next. The Dark Lord had moved forward to the altar. He knelt there and seemed to reach deep into the stone of the altar itself, drawing forth a vial of liquid that looked black in the fading twilight. When the Dark Lord spoke again, his voice was clipped and precise. "Blood, blood, blood so wisely hidden," said the Dark Lord, and the obelisks surrounding the altar began to speak, voices like a chanting chorus coming from the motionless stones, cadences older than Latin. Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to soma muimoi. Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to soma muimoi. The obelisk's chant echoed after the end of each line, as if they were speaking out of synchrony with each other. The blood was poured from the vial, and it seemed to catch and hang over the altar, slowly expanding through the air, taking on a shape. Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to soma muimoi, imoi. Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to soma muimoi, imoi. A tall form rested upon the altar, and even in the dimming twilight it looked too pale. The defense professor reached his hand into his robe and drew forth a small, irregular chunk of red glass. He placed that upon the tall, pale body. The stone stayed there for a time, minutes at least. The irregular chunk of red glass did not glow or flash or give any other indication of power. Then the stone moved, just a little, turning slightly upon the body. The defense professor took back the stone into his robes and prodded the tall form that lay motionless upon the altar, touching the eyes with his fingers, poking the chest with his wand. He threw back his head then and laughed. "Incredible," said the Dark Lord, in the voice of the defense professor that Harry had known. "Fixed, it is fixed in form, a mere construct sustained by magic, become the true substance at the stone's touch. And yet I sensed nothing, nothing. I feared I had been deceived, that I had obtained a false stone, but the substance proves true to my every test." The defense professor tucked the red glass back into his robes. "That is eldritch even by my standards, I admit." Then the defense professor walked around the altar. 5 times he walked around it, chanting something too low for Harry to hear. The Dark Lord placed his wand in the hand of the figure lying on the altar. He placed his hands, both of them, over the body's forehead. The Dark Lord spoke. "Fal, tor pan." Without any warning, there was a flash like lightning that lit up the entire graveyard, and Harry staggered back a step, his hands involuntarily going to his forehead. It felt as if he had been shot there, or a wasp stung him upon his scar. The defense professor collapsed, and the too-tall figure sat up upon the altar. It swung around smoothly and stood tall upon the ground, at least a head higher than a normal man. The form's limbs were lean and pale, little muscled, but giving an impression of terrible strength. Harry took another staggering step back, his hands still clasped to his scar. Though the distance between them was wide, Harry felt a sense of terrifying apprehension in the air, as though the sense of doom had always been out of focus and had now clarified, concentrated into a physical pain in the scar on Harry's forehead. Was that what Voldemort was supposed to look like? The nose looked like it had malfunctioned during the resurrection process. The too-tall figure threw back his head and laughed, raising his hands and wand to look at them. The left hand opened wide, and it was like a pale half-spider with 4 overlong legs, fingers caressing the wand held in the other hand. Leaves stirred up from the graveyard, approaching to dance around the too-tall figure, surrounding him and clothing him, reforming into a high-necked shirt and flowing robes, and Lord Voldemort was laughing. Exactly the mirthless laughter that Harry remembered coming from his own throat inside the Dementor's nightmare, precise in tone and timbre. Red eyes gleamed beneath the fading twilight, their pupils slitted like a cat's. The form that Voldemort had abandoned raised itself, quivering from the ground, and in a voice that Harry could barely hear, Quirinus Quirrell gasped. "Free, oh, free, stupefy," said the high cold voice of Voldemort, and Quirinus Quirrell was blasted down into the ground. Then, with a wave of Voldemort's other hand, Quirinus Quirrell was picked up and flung away from the altar. Voldemort walked away from the altar, then turned and looked at Harry, and the pain in Harry's scar flared at it. "Frightened, child," Voldemort hissed, like there was an undercurrent of Parseltongue even to the Dark Lord's human speech. "Good. Place the girl on the altar and break your transfiguration. It's time for me to revive her. Is this really going to happen? Are we really going to do this?" Harry swallowed, mastering his fear through that note of impossible hope amid the confusion, and walked over to the altar. Then Harry took off his left shoe and his left sock, and took off the toe ring that was Hermione Granger, the transfigured shape identical to the toe ring that had been given Harry as an emergency portkey. There was a twinge of regret in Harry for not having the real portkey now, but only a twinge. An inner circle Death Eater would routinely put up boundaries against portkeys if Severus had been right. Behind Harry, Voldemort laughed again in what sounded like surprised appreciation. "Need my wand to finite her," Harry said aloud. "You do not, high the voice and cruel. You learn to sustain a transfiguration by touch alone, without further use of the wand. You can likewise break your own transfiguration wandlessly by commanding your sustaining magic to drain away. Do so now." Harry swallowed and touched the toe ring. He had to try 3 times and clear his mind before he could push his magic out of the toe ring, as before he had learned to make a tiny stream of magic flow in. The breaking of the spell went much more slowly that way than a finite incantatum, almost like the sped-up reverse of watching something being transfigured. The toe ring distorted, flowing together, expanding. Colors changed, textures changed. 2/3 of a dead girl lay strewn across the altar, on her side with one arm falling off the altar's edge, the position in which the reversion had chanced to place her. No blood flowed now from the chewed stumps of her thighs. The dead girl wore Hermione Granger's face, but twisted and pale. It was as Harry had seen before in the hospital's back room. The image burned into his brain during 30 long minutes of transfiguration. The image he had reproduced during 4 even longer hours to transfigure the decoy. The dead girl was naked, for her clothes were not part of her and had not been transfigured. The sight brought back flashbacks of the hours spent in the infirmary room, of the nightmares afterward, all of which Harry suppressed. "Go back," said Voldemort's high voice. "This is my work now." Harry swallowed and retreated from the altar to the mouth of the long corridor where he'd stood before. "Her body should be around 5 Celsius. I cooled her so there wouldn't be brain damage." Harry's own voice was wavering in pitch. "Is he really going to do this? Really?" There had to be a catch, and Harry just couldn't see it. Voldemort had said that neither he nor any of his would harm Hermione, that her body and mind would be her own. Why? Voldemort walked forth to the altar once more, orienting the body before him with a wave of his hand to lie straight across the altar. The Dark Lord spoke with high monotone precision. "Flesh, flesh, flesh, so wisely hidden." The obelisks began chanting once more. "Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to Soma hu emoi, emoi. Apocataste, apocataste, apocataste to Soma hu emoi, emoi." New flesh flowed out of the stumps of the girl's thighs, creeping forward like an ooze and solidifying. The obelisk ceased chanting. A complete form lay naked upon the altar. It didn't look like Hermione. A Hermione Granger should be standing up and talking. She should have her Hogwarts uniform. Voldemort raised a hand, then hissed as though in annoyance. With a violent gesture, the robes around Quirrell sleeping from were torn in half, his purple and green tie shredded, and his suit jacket drawn from him to where Voldemort stood. Some part of Harry flinched, as if seeing the Dark Lord Voldemort attacking Professor Quirrell. Voldemort plunged his hand deliberately into the suit jacket, which jerked as though something were being broken. Then Voldemort shook out the suit jacket onto the ground beside him, emptying out the contents. Harry's pouch fell from it, and his time-turner, and a broomstick and Voldemort's gun, and the cloak, and a number of amulets and rings and stranger devices that Harry did not recognize. And finally, a chunk of red glass, which was laid upon Hermione Granger's form and allowed to stay there for a time. Minutes passed. The Dark Lord donned an amulet from the heap of things beside the altar. Also from the heap, Voldemort took 4 short wooden rods with straps upon them and reached beneath his robes to attach them. It looked like they went on his upper arms and upper thighs. The Dark Lord rose into the air, moved left, right, up and down, seeming to wobble slightly at first. Then his flight stabilized. The chunk of red glass turned slightly. The Dark Lord Voldemort floated to the ground and prodded Hermione Granger's body with his wand. "There is an obstacle," hissed Voldemort. In Harry's mind, the expectation of betrayal or other failure had already been so strong that the confirmation came only as a dull shock, not a sharp one. "What obstacle? Girl's body is rested. Substance is repaired, but not magic or life. This is body of dead muggle." Voldemort turned from the altar, began to pace. The full ritual would solve this, but that would require time. Time and the blood of Granger's enemy, and I do not think Draco Malfoy still qualifies, nor can I take my own blood unwillingly. Foolish. Voldemort's voice was a lower hiss. Foolish. I should have foreseen this and prepared. Her brain might awaken with an electrical shock. I know that much of Muggle medicine. But would her magic return to her? That I do not know, and I suspect if she awakens as a Muggle, she will be a Muggle forever. Still, I can think of nothing better. The Dark Lord raised his wand. Wait, Harry blurted, feeling hope return. She needs a spark of life and magic, just a spark to get her started. Voldemort turned and looked at him. The snake-like face showed some slight degree of surprise. Think I have something that might work, Harry hissed. Needs wand. Have no intentions to us it against you. Harry said nothing about expecting his intentions wouldn't change. He'd simply blurted out the idea fast enough that he hadn't formed any specific intentions yet. This, Voldemort hissed, I desire to see. The Dark Lord reached into the heap of things by the altar and picked up the wrapped form of Harry's wand. It was thrown, gliding through the air and then dropping at Harry's feet. And then the Dark Lord floated back, the heap of things moving smoothly backwards with him. Harry unwrapped his wand and moved forward. We have our wand back, that's step one, said the last voice, the voice of hope. No part of Harry had any idea what step two might be, but it was still step one accomplished. And Harry stood before the reformed body of Hermione Granger, who was still naked and dead, on a twilight-lit stone altar. Lord Voldemort, Harry said, I beg you, please give her some clothes. It might help me do this. Granted, hissed Voldemort. The pain in Harry's scar flared as the naked girl's body lifted into the air, then flared again as dead leaves danced around her, and she was clothed in the seeming of a Hogwarts uniform, though the trim was red instead of blue. Hermione Granger's hands folded over her chest, her legs straightened, and her body drifted back down. Harry looked at her, focused on her, now that she looked human again. She looks like she is sleeping, not dead. It took a conscious effort to look for breathing, fail to see it, and make the deduction. So far as naked perception was concerned, Hermione might as well be alive right now. That Hermione Granger would not approve of this situation, taken as a whole, seemed beyond question. But it didn't mean that she would rather stay dead than be alive, other things being equal, though they might not be. Because you wish to live, because my best guess is that you would wish to live. Harry reached out his shaking left hand and touched Hermione's forehead. It was warm now, not the chill of 5 degrees Celsius. Either Voldemort had increased her body temperature to normal, or the magic of the ritual had done it automatically, which meant that Hermione's brain was currently warm and without oxygen. Come to think, that did it, the sense of urgency rising in him. Harry's feet assumed the stance. His wand swung up to point at Hermione Granger's dead body. The only thing wrong with Hermione's body was that it was dead. Everything else about that body was right. Only one thing needed changing. You don't belong here, Death. Expecto, Harry shouted, feeling the magic and the life rise up into the Patronus charm that was fueled by both. Patronum. The girl in the Hogwarts uniform was surrounded by a blazing aura of silver fire as the Patronus was born inside her. Harry staggered as he felt a dip, a bite. Intuition, or Tom Riddle's memory, told Harry that the life and magic that had just flowed into Hermione would never return to him, either one. It hadn't been all his life, or all his magic, not by a long shot. There hadn't been time to expend that much, but whatever he'd just expended was gone forever. And Hermione Granger was breathing, just like she was sleeping, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations. The twilight sky had dimmed further, and Harry could not see if color was returning to her, but it should have been, it certainly should have been. She looked to be sleeping peacefully, and it wasn't because being dead looked like sleeping. It was because she was asleep and her body was fine, and nothing was hurting her while she slept. Some part of Harry that had somehow managed not to speak up earlier quietly pointed out that they were still in a graveyard. The recently victorious Lord Voldemort was still in control of the situation, and that his guess about Hermione wanting to be alive was just a guess. Harry was still smiling as he slowly lowered his wand. The celebratory fireworks going off inside his mind were restrained. Harry wasn't screaming and running around in little circles like Professor Flitwick. But that, Harry said aloud inside his mind, That is what I call step 2. Interesting, said the cold, high voice. Your patroness draws upon your life as well as your magic. I guessed that much, for it was too powerful for a first year to fuel with magic alone. And yet there must be more to the puzzle, since not just any life-fueled spell would have done. Was your happy thought the image of her returning to life? Was that all it took? Lord Voldemort was again toying with his wand, a dark interest in those red-slitted eyes. I suspect I will feel quite stupid when I finally comprehend that spell, someday in my eternity. Now step away from the girl. There is more work I intend to do to give her best chance of continued life. Harry stepped back, reluctantly, the sense of tension starting to return to him. He almost tripped over one haphazard grave marker as the Dark Lord continued to walk forward. Standing before the altar, the Dark Lord laid one finger upon Hermione Granger's forehead. Then the Dark Lord tapped his finger upon Hermione Granger's forehead and said, in a voice so low Harry almost did not hear, Requiescat. Voldemort waved his hand at an obelisk, which began to rotate, turning itself to lay flat upon the ground, pointing outward. Fascinating indeed, Voldemort hissed. She is alive and magical, and not another Tom Riddle as I feared you might have made her. The tension was rising again in Harry. He put his wand away into the back belt of his pants. He did not want to remind Voldemort that he still had the wand on him. What are you doing to her now? Another obelisk turned, lay flat upon the ground. There is old, lost ritual to S sacrifice magical creature, transfer magical nature to S subject. Limitations are great. Transfer is temporary, only few hours. S subject S sometime S dece when transfer wears off, but S stone will make permanent. 4 obelisks lay flat upon the ground, evenly spaced. The other 2 obelisks had been floated away. Voldemort began to reach into his own mouth, checked himself, hissed with annoyance again. He gestured at the sleeping mouth of Quirinus Quirrell, and from Quirrell's mouth floated up 2 teeth, almost invisible in the falling night. One of these went to the pile of items, the other floated to before the altar. Moments later, Harry cried out and took a step back. Huge and misshapen, lumpy skin, legs thick as tree trunks, a small head that looked like a coconut perched upon a boulder. A mountain troll stood within the circle of obelisks, motionless as though asleep while standing. What are you doing? Voldemort's mouth was stretched in a wide smile. It looked horrible on him, like his face had too many teeth. Eschol S sacrifice my fallback weapon, and girl-child Eschol gain Troll's S power of regeneration. Transfiguration S sickness is nothing before that, if perchance it was not fixed by previous ritual. And no knife Eschol S slay girl-child, nor cutting curse, nor S sickness take her. Why are you doing this? Harry's voice shook. Have not the tinnest intention of letting girl-child die again after going to such lengths to resurrect her. Harry swallowed. I'm very confused. Was Voldemort practicing being nice? This hypothesis did not seem like a sufficient explanation. Stay well back, Voldemort said coldly. This ritual is darker than the last. The Dark Lord began a new chant, softer syllables that seemed to seethe through the air like living things, and Harry, feeling a new surge of apprehension, stepped backwards. Then Harry cried aloud, as pain flared again within his scar. The mountain troll crumbled in on itself, becoming ashes hanging in the air, then dust, and then the dust seemed to blow away without going anywhere. It was gone. Hermione Granger slept on peacefully, whatever spell of repose Voldemort had cast on her being sufficient to the task. Harry said in a small voice. Did it work? Defindo. Harry stepped forward with a choked yell, and then halted, both as the stupidity of his motion caught up with him, and as the sudden cut that the severing charm had opened on Hermione's leg closed almost as quickly as it had been made. In seconds, there was only a light stain of blood on the surrounding flesh. The stone was laid again on Hermione, and after a time it turned. Voldemort laughed once more as he passed his hand over her. Marvelous! Then another tiny tooth was floating within the circle of obelisks, and an instant later a unicorn stood where the troll had stood before, eyes dull and head lowered. What? Harry said. Why a unicorn? The power of unicorn's blood to preserve life makes excellent combination with troll's healing. Only fiendfire and killing curse Eschol girl-child fear from this day. A flicker of snackish laughter. Besides, had spare unicorn left over might as well us. Unicorn's blood has side effects. That is, only when power of unicorn's blood is stolen by another. This spell will make power of unicorn belong inside girl child, as if she was always born that way. The grim chant and its seething words began again. Harry watched, not understanding in the slightest. Forget understanding. What am I seeing? I'm seeing the Dark Lord Voldemort going to enormous lengths to resurrect Hermione Granger and keep her alive. It's like he thinks that his own life depends on Hermione Granger being alive, somehow. The confused parts of Harry looked around for a procedure to follow. Make a prediction based on your best current hypothesis was the first thought that came to mind, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere. The plot of the story wasn't going how it ought to, after the villain had won. Again the blaze of pain in his scar, like a blow to Harry's forehead. The unicorn swayed, and then disintegrated as the troll had done. The Dark Lord laid the stone upon Hermione's form once more, clasping her hands around it. Voldemort watched the unremarkable process for a time, then turned while the stone still laid on her, making a high humming sound in his throat. "Ah, yes," hissed Voldemort. "That would be most appropriate. Do you still have the diary I gave you, boy? The diary of the famous scientist?" Harry's brain took a moment to place what Voldemort was talking about. It had been in Mary's room, in Mary's place, in October, that precious gift from a friend. The thought should have triggered a wave of awful sadness for the Professor Quirrell that had been lost or never real. But there had been enough of that emotion already, and his brain had set it aside for now. "Yes," Harry said aloud. "I think it's in my pouch. Can I check?" Harry knew it was in the pouch. He'd loaded it up with everything that he might possibly conceivably need, that he owned or had bought, everything that could have been a quest item. From the heap of items by the altar, Harry's moleskin pouch was drawn out, tossed to Harry's feet. "Roger Bacon's diary," Harry said as he reached in a hand, and the diary appeared. Professor Quirrell had said that the diary would emerge unscathed from a fire, so Harry threw it toward Voldemort's altar. Harry did not wince. There were more important things to worry about than polite treatment of books, even that one. Voldemort picked up the diary, examining it, appearing quite absorbed. Harry, as quietly and unobtrusively as he could, attached the pouch to his belt loop in back, where it wouldn't be visible near where Harry had put his wand. Step 3, the pouch. "Yes," Voldemort hissed as he flipped pages of the diary. "This will do quite well." The stone moved slightly, and the Dark Lord's other hand stored the stone again within his robes. "What was your hidden purpose behind the diary?" Harry said when the pouch was attached to his belt, and he put both of his empty hands where Voldemort could see them again. "I tried translating a little at the beginning, but it was going slowly. Actually, it had been excruciatingly slow, and Harry had found other priorities. Diary was exactly what it seemed, a gift meant to seduce you to my side." Voldemort made intricate gestures in the air with his wand, not even looking at what his hand was doing, as he held the diary in his other hand. For a moment, Harry thought he could see a trail of darkness in the air, but the moonlight was too faint for certainty. "And now, my dear boy," Voldemort's high voice was laced with grim amusement as his wand briefly tapped Hermione Granger's forehead with a casual gesture. "I make this diary into a far more precious gift, a sign of how much wisdom I have learned from you. For I would never want you to be deprived of Hermione Granger's counsel and restraint, not ever while the stars yet live. Avada Kedavra." The green bolt of the killing curse blazed out faster than Harry could possibly have cast the Patronus charm, faster than he could possibly have moved. It was already over even as Harry cried out and went for his wand. Quirinus Quirrell's unconscious body did not even jerk in death. The green light struck into it without other sign. Darkness glowed in the air, anti-light in the trails that Voldemort had made before, and the diary of Roger Bacon darkened as though corruption were creeping over it, even as a shiver appeared in the air around Hermione Granger's form. The pain in Harry's scar flared overwhelmingly, like a brand driven into his forehead. It sent Harry dodging unthinkingly to one side as Tom Riddle's reflexes took over. And Voldemort was also screaming, shrieking as he dropped the diary to the ground, holding his own head and screaming. "Chance," the last voice of hope said that, as Harry tried frantically to think, to understand. There wasn't any point in trying to kill Voldemort now. It might only annoy him, Weapons couldn't kill him while any of his hundreds of Horcruxes remained, but it still seemed worth it to temporarily discarnate Voldemort, take the stone and Hermione, and run. Harry's right hand had already taken his wand. His left hand went around to his back, reached awkwardly into his pouch, began to make a silent sign, 3 English letters. "No," cried Voldemort. He dropped his hands from his head, was staring at Hermione's body as though bewildered. "No, no." The item came up from Harry's pouch into his hand, and Harry began to step forward as smoothly as he could, diminishing the range between them to what his brief trials had shown was doable. "My great creation," gasped Voldemort. His voice was high, sounding panicked. "2 different spirits cannot exist in the same world. It is gone. It is severed. A Horcrux. I must make a Horcrux at once." Voldemort's gaze fell on Hermione Granger's still sleeping form, and he began to raise his wand in the air, executing the same gestures as before. Harry raised his gun and pulled the trigger 3 times. The next chapter will post in 25 hours at 1 p.m. Pacific/9 p.m. UTC. I'll be on a train, though, so don't panic if it's a little late.